8. Saturday, January 11th, Boston, Massachusetts. The memorial service for Pablo Jackson was held at 11 o'clock Saturday morning, January 11th, in a non-denominational chapel on the grounds of the cemetery where he was to be buried. The coroner and police pathologist had not been finished with the body until Thursday, so 5 days had passed between Pablo's murder and his funeral. When the last eulogy was delivered, the mourners adjourned to the grave where the casket waited. Snow had been cleared around Pablo's plot, but the space was insufficient. Scores of people stood outside the prepared area, some in snow deeper than their boots. Others remained on the sidewalks that crisscrossed the memorial park, watching from a distance. 300 had come to pay their last respects to the old magician. The chilly air steamed with the breath of the rich and the poor, the famous and the unknown, Boston socialites, magicians. Ginger Weiss and Rita Hanneby stood in the first circle around the gravesite. Since Monday, Ginger had not had much of an appetite and had gotten little sleep. She was pale, nervous, and very tired. Both Rita and George had argued against Ginger's attendance at the services. They were concerned that such a wrenchingly emotional experience would trigger a fugue, but the police had encouraged her, hoping she might see Pablo's killer at the services. In self-defense, she'd hidden the truth from the cops, leading them to believe that the killer was an ordinary burglar, and sometimes burglars were driven by such sick compulsions. But she knew that he was no mere burglar and that he would not risk arrest by coming to the cemetery. Ginger wept during the eulogies, and by the time she walked from the chapel to the grave, her grief was a vice squeezing her heart. But she did not lose control. She was determined not to make a circus of this solemn occasion, determined to pay her respects with dignity. Besides, she had come with a second purpose that could not be fulfilled if she spiraled down into a fugue or suffered an emotional collapse. She was sure that Alexander Christopherson, former ambassador to Great Britain, former United States Senator, and former director of the CIA, would be at the funeral of his old friend, and she wanted very much to speak with him. It was to Christopherson on Christmas Day that Pablo had turned for advice about Ginger's problems, and it was Alex Christopherson who had told him about the Azrael blot. She had an important question to ask Christopherson, though she dreaded the answer. She had seen him in the chapel, recognized him from his days in public life when he had been on television and in newspapers. He was a striking figure, tall, thin, white-haired, unmistakable. Now they stood on opposite sides of the grave, the draped casket between them. He had glanced at her a couple times, though without recognition. The minister said a brief final prayer. After a moment, some of the mourners greeted one another, formed small groups to talk. Others, including Christopherson, moved away through a forest of headstones, past snow-laden pines and winter-strip maples toward the parking lot. "I've got to talk to that man," Ginger told Rita. "Be right back." Startled, Rita called after her, but Ginger did not pause or offer further explanation. She caught up with Christopherson in the jagged shadows cast by the skeletal branches of an immense oak that was all black bark and crusted snow. She called his name and he turned. He had piercing gray eyes which widened when she told him who she was. "I can't help you," he said, and began to turn away from her. "Please," she said, putting a hand on his arm. "If you blame me for what happened to Pablo—" "Why should you care what I think, Doctor?" She held fast to his arm. "Wait, please, for God's sake." Christopherson surveyed the slowly dispersing crowd in the cemetery, and Ginger knew that he was afraid the wrong people, dangerous people, might see him with her and assume he was helping her as Pablo had done. His head twitched slightly, and Ginger thought it was an indication of his nervousness, but then she realized it was the faint tremor of Parkinson's disease. He said, "Dr. Weiss, if you're seeking some form of absolution, then by all means let me provide it. Pablo knew the risks, and he accepted them. He was the captain of his own fate." Did he understand the risks? That's what I've got to know. Christopherson seemed surprised. "I warned him myself." "Warned him about who? About what?" "I don't know who or what, but considering the enormous effort expended to tamper with your memory, you must have seen something of tremendous importance. I warned Pablo that whoever had brainwashed you was no amateur, and that if they realized the two of you were trying to break through the Azrael block, they might come after not just you, but him as well. Christofson's gray eyes searched her eyes for a moment, and then he sighed. He did tell you about his conversation with me? He told me everything, except about your warning. Her eyes filled with tears again. He didn't breathe a word of that. He withdrew one elegant but palsied hand from his pocket and gripped her arm reassuringly. Doctor, now that you've told me this, I can't possibly lay any of the blame at your doorstep. But I blame me, Ginger said in a voice thin with misery. No, you can't blame yourself for any of it. Looking around again to make sure they were not under surveillance, Christofson opened the top 2 buttons of his overcoat, reached inside, plucked the display handkerchief from the breast pocket of his suit jacket, and gave it to Ginger. Please stop punishing yourself. Our friend lived a full and fortunate life, Doctor. His death might have been violent, but it was relatively quick, which can be a blessing. Drying her eyes on the swatch of pale blue silk that he had given her, Ginger said he was a dear man. He was, Christofson agreed, and I'm beginning to understand why he took the risks he did for you. He said you were a very dear woman, and I see his judgment was as accurate and reliable as usual. She finished blotting her eyes. Her heart still felt pinched in a vice, but she began to believe there was a chance that guilt and grief would eventually give way to grief alone. Thank you. As much to herself as to him, Ginger said, What now? Where do I go from here? I'm in no position to help you, he said at once. I've been out of the intelligence business for almost a decade, and I have no contacts anymore. I have no idea who might be behind your memory block or why. I wouldn't ask you to help me. I'm not risking any more innocent lives. I just thought you might have some idea how I can help myself. Go to the police. It's their job to help. Ginger shook her head. No, the police are slow, too slow. Most of them are overworked, and the rest are just bureaucrats in uniforms. My problem's too urgent to wait for them to solve it. Besides, I don't trust them. Suddenly, I don't trust authorities of any kind. The tapes Pablo made of our sessions were gone when I took the police back to his apartment, so I didn't mention them. I spooked. I didn't tell the cops about my fugues or about how Pablo had been helping me. I just said we'd been friends, that I'd stopped by to have lunch and walked in on the killer. I let them think it was an ordinary burglary, sheer paranoia. Didn't trust them, still don't, so the cops are out. Then find another hypnotist to regress you. No, I'm not risking any more innocent lives, she repeated. I understand, but those are the only suggestions I have. He shoved both hands into the deep pockets of his overcoat. I'm sorry. No need to be, she said. He started to turn away, hesitated, sighed. Doctor, I want you to understand me. I served in the war, the big war, with some distinction. Later, I was a good ambassador. As head of the CIA and as a senator, I made many difficult decisions, some that put me in personal danger. I never backed away from risk, but I'm an old man now, 76, and I feel older. Parkinson's, a bad heart, high blood pressure. I have a wife I love very much, and if anything happens to me, she'll be alone. I don't know how well she'd deal with being alone, Dr. Weiss. Please, there's no need to justify yourself, Ginger said. She realized how completely and quickly the roles had reversed. In the beginning, he had been the one full of reassurances and absolution. Now she was returning the favor. Jacob, her father, had often said that the capacity for mercy was humankind's greatest virtue, and that the giving and receiving of mercy formed a bond unbreakable. Ginger remembered Jacob's words now because in allowing Alex Christofson to allay her guilt and in trying to allay his, she felt that bond. Apparently, he felt it too, for although he did not stop trying to explain himself, his explanations became more intimate and were offered now in a tone of voice that was less defensive and more conspiratorial. Quite frankly, Doctor, my reluctance to get involved is not so much because I find life infinitely precious, but because I am increasingly afraid of death." As he spoke, he reached into an inside pocket and withdrew a notepad and pen. "In my life, I've done some things of which I'm not proud." Holding the pen in his palsied right hand, he began to print. True, most of those sins were committed in the line of duty. Government and espionage are both necessary, but neither is a clean business. In those days, I didn't believe in God or in afterlife. Now I wonder, and wondering, I'm sometimes afraid. He tore the top page from the pad. "Afraid of what might await me after death, you see? That's why I want to hold on to life as long as I can, Doctor. That's why, God help me, I've become a coward in my old age." As Kristoff unfolded and passed to her the slip of paper on which he had been printing, Ginger realized that he had managed to put his back to all of the remaining mourners before he had removed the notepad and pen from his coat. No one could have seen what he had done. He said, "I've just given you the phone number of an antique store in Greenwich, Connecticut. My younger brother, Philip, owns the place. You can't call me direct because the wrong people may have seen us talking. My telephone might be tapped. I won't risk associating with you, Dr. Weiss, and I won't pursue any investigation of your problem. However, I have many years of broad experience in these matters, and there may be times when that experience will be of help to you. You may encounter something you don't understand, a situation you don't know how to deal with, and I may be able to offer advice. Just call Philip and leave your number with him. He'll immediately call me at home and use a prearranged code word. Then I'll go out to a payphone, return his call, get the number you left with him, and contact you as quickly as possible. Experience, my peculiar kind of malevolent experience, is all I'm willing to offer you, Dr. Weiss. It's more than enough. You're not obligated to help me at all. Good luck." He turned abruptly and walked away, his boots crunching in the frozen snow. Ginger returned to the grave where Rita, the mortician, and 2 laborers were the only people remaining. The velvet curtain around the grave had been collapsed and removed. A plastic tarpaulin had been pulled off a waiting mound of earth. "What was that all about?" Rita asked. "Tell you later," Ginger said, bending down to pick up a rose from the pile of flowers beside Pablo Jackson's final resting place. She leaned forward and tossed the bloom into the hole on top of the casket. "Alav HaSholem, may this sleep be only a little dream between this world and something better. Baruch Hashem." As she and Rita walked away, Ginger heard the laborers begin to shovel dirt onto the casket. Elko County, Nevada. Dr. Fontaine was satisfied that Ernie Block was cured of his disabling nyctophobia. "Fastest cure I've ever seen," he said. "I guess you Marines are tougher than ordinary mortals." On Saturday, January 11th, after only 4 weeks in Milwaukee, Ernie and Faye went home. They flew into Reno on United, then caught a 10-seat commuter flight to Elko, arriving at 11:27 in the morning. Sandy Sarver met them at the airport in Elko, though Ernie did not immediately recognize her. She was standing by the small terminal in the crystalline winter sunshine, waving as Ernie and Faye disembarked. Gone was the pale-faced mouse, the familiar slump-shouldered front. For the first time since Ernie had known her, Sandy was wearing a little makeup, eyeshadow, and lipstick. Her nails were no longer bitten. Her hair, always limp and dull and neglected in the past, was now full, glossy. She had gained 10 pounds. She had always looked older than she was. Now she looked years younger. She blushed when Ernie and Faye raved about her makeover. She pretended the changes were of little consequence, but she was clearly pleased by their praise, approval, and delight. She had changed in other ways as well. For one thing, she was usually reticent and shy, but as they walked to the parking lot and put the baggage in the back of her red pickup, she asked lots of questions about Lucy, Frank, and the grandchildren. She did not ask about Ernie's phobia because she knew nothing of it. They had kept his condition secret and had explained the extension of their Wisconsin visit by saying they wanted to spend more time with the grandchildren. In the truck, as Sandy drove through Elko and onto the interstate, she was downright garrulous, as she spoke of the Christmas just past and of business at the Tranquility Grill. As much as anything, Sandy's driving surprised Ernie. He knew she had an aversion to four-wheel travel, but now she drove fast with an ease and skill Ernie had never seen in her before. Faye, sitting between Ernie and Sandy, was aware of this change too, for she gave Ernie meaningful looks when Sandy maneuvered the pickup with special fluidity and audacity. Then a bad thing happened. Less than a mile from the motel, Ernie's interest in Sandy's metamorphosis was suddenly displaced by the queer feeling that had first seized him on December 10th, when he'd been coming home from Elko with the new lighting fixtures. The feeling that a particular piece of ground half a mile ahead, south of the highway, was calling him. The feeling that something strange had happened to him out there. As before, it was simultaneously an absurd and gripping feeling, characterized by the eerie attraction of a talismanic place in a dream. This was an unsettling development because Ernie had supposed that the peculiar magnetism of that place had been, somehow, a part of the same mental disturbance that resulted in his crippling dread of the dark. His nyctophobia cured, he had assumed that all other symptoms of his temporary psychological imbalance would disappear along with his fear of the night. So this seemed like a bad sign. He did not want to consider what it might indicate about the permanency of his cure. Faye was telling Sandy about Christmas morning with the grandkids, and Sandy was laughing, but to Ernie the laughter and conversation faded. As they drew nearer the plot of ground that exerted a mesmeric attraction on him, Ernie squinted through the sunstreak windshield, possessed by a sense of impending epiphany. Something of monumental importance seemed about to happen, and he was filled with fear and awe. Then, as they were passing that beguiling place, Ernie became aware that their speed had dropped. Sandy had slowed to under 40 miles an hour, half the speed she had maintained since Elko. Even as Ernie realized the truck had slowed, it accelerated again. He looked at Sandy, too late to be certain that she also had been temporarily spellbound by that same portion of the landscape, for now she was listening to Faye and watching the road ahead and bringing the pickup back to speed. But it seemed to him there was a strange look on her face, and he stared at her in bewilderment, wondering how she could share his mysterious and irrational fascination with that piece of quite ordinary land. "It's good to be home," Faye said, as Sandy switched on the right turn signal and steered the truck toward the exit lane. Ernie watched Sandy for an indication that she had slowed the truck in answer to the same eerie call that he felt, but he saw none of the fear that the call engendered in him. She was smiling. He must have been wrong. She had slowed the truck for some other reason. A chill had taken residence in his bones, and now, as they drove up the Slope County Road and turned into the motel lot, he felt the cold, damp dew of sweat on his palms, on his scalp. He looked at his watch, not because he needed to know the time, but because he wanted to know how long until sundown. About 5 hours. What if it wasn't darkness in general that he feared? What if it was a specific darkness? Perhaps he had quickly overcome his phobia in Milwaukee because he was only mildly frightened by the night out there. Perhaps his real fear, his deep fear, was of the darkness of the Nevada plains. Could a phobia be that narrowly focused, that localized? Surely not. Yet he looked at his watch. Sandy parked in front of the motel office, and when they got out of the truck and went around to the tailgate to get the luggage, she hugged both Faye and Ernie. "I'm glad you're back. I missed you both. Now I'd better get over to the diner and help Ned. Lunch hour started." Ernie and Faye watched Sandy as she hurried away, and Faye said, "What on earth do you suppose happened to her?" "Damned if I know," Ernie said. Her breath steamy in the cold air, Faye said, "At first I thought she must have learned she's pregnant, but now I don't think so. If she was pregnant and overjoyed about it, she'd have told us. She'd have been bursting with the news. I think it's something else." Ernie pulled 2 of the 4 suitcases out of the back of the truck and stood them on the ground, surreptitiously glancing at his watch as he put the bags down. Sundown was 5 minutes closer. Faye sighed. Well, whatever the cause, I'm sure happy for her. Me too, Ernie said, lifting the other 2 bags out of the truck. Me too, Faye said, affectionately mimicking him as she picked up the 2 lightest suitcases. Don't play cool with me, you big softy. I know you've worried about her almost like you used to worry about our own Lucy. When you first saw the change in Sandy back at the airport, I was watching you, and I thought your heart was going to melt. He followed her with the 2 heavier bags. Do they have a medical term for a calamity like that, for a melting heart? Sure. Cardioliquefaction. He laughed in spite of the tension that knotted his stomach. Faye was always able to make him laugh, usually when he needed it most. When they got inside, he would put his arms around her, kiss her, and convey her straight upstairs and into bed. Nothing else would be as certain to chase away the fear that had popped up in him like a jack-in-the-box. Time spent with Faye was always the best medicine. She put her 2 bags down by the office door and fished her keys out of her purse. When it had become clear early on that Ernie was likely to have an exceptionally swift recovery and that they would not need to stay in Milwaukee for months, Faye had decided against flying home to search for a motel manager. They simply kept the place closed. Now they needed to unlock, turn up the thermostat, clean away the accumulated dust. A lot of work to be done, but still enough time for a little horizontal dancing first, Ernie thought with a grin. He was standing behind Faye as she put the key in the office door, so fortunately she did not see him twitch and jump in surprise when the bright day was suddenly claimed by shadows. They were not actually plunged into darkness. A large cloud merely moved across the sun. The level of light dropped by no more than 20%, yet even that was sufficient to startle and unnerve him. He looked at his watch. He looked toward the east from whence the night would come. I'll be all right, he thought. I'm cured. On the road, Reno to Elko County. Following the paranormal experience in Lomax's house on Tuesday, when countless paper moons took orbit around him, Dominic Corvasis spent a few days in Reno. On his previous journey from Portland to Mountain View, he had stayed over to research a series of short stories about gambling. Recreating that trip, he passed Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday in the biggest little city in the world. Dom wandered from casino to casino, watching gamblers. There were young couples, retirees, pretty young women, middle-aged women in stretch pants and cardigans, leather-faced cowboys fresh from the range, and soft-faced rich men on junkets from far cities. Secretaries, truckers, executives, doctors, ex-cons, and off-duty cops, hustlers and dreamers, escapees from every social background, drawn together by the hope and thrill of organized games of chance, surely the most democratizing industry on earth. As during his previous visit, Dom gambled only enough to be part of the scene, for his primary purpose was to observe. After the storm of paper moons, he had reason to believe that Reno was the place where his life had been changed forever, and where he would find the key to unlock his imprisoned memories. Those around him laughed, chattered, grumbled about the unkindness of cards, shouted to encourage the rolling dice, but Dom remained cool and alert among them, yet distanced from them, the better to spot any clue to the unremembered events in his past. No clue was revealed. Each night he contacted Parker Fane in Laguna Beach, hoping that the unknown correspondent had sent an additional message. No message was received. Each night before sleep came, he tried to understand the impossible dance of paper moons, and he sought an explanation of the circular, swollen red rings in his hands, which he had watched fade as he knelt in a drift of moons in Lomax's living room. No understanding came. Day by day, his craving for Valium and Dalmane diminished, but his unremembered nightmares, the moon, grew worse. Each night he fought fiercely against the tether with which he moored himself to his bed. By Saturday, Dom still suspected that the answer to his night fear and somnambulism lay in Reno, but he decided that he must not change his plans, must go on to Mountain View. If he concluded the journey without achieving Satori, he could return to Reno at that time. The summer before last, he departed Harrah's at 10:30 a.m. Friday, July 6th, after an early lunch. On Saturday, January 11th, he therefore followed that timetable, driving on to I-80 at 10:40, heading northeast across the Nevada wasteland toward distant Winnemucca, where Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid had robbed a bank in another age. The immense, unpopulated expanses of land were a little different from the way they had been 1,000 years ago. The highway and power lines, often the only signs of civilization, followed the route that had been called the Humboldt Trail in the days of wagon trains. Dom drove over barren plains and hills bearded with scrub, through an uninviting yet starkly beautiful primeval world of sagebrush, sand, alkaline flats, dry lakes, solidified lava beds with columnar crystallizations, distant mountains. Sheared bluffs and veined monoliths showed traces of borax, sulfur, alum, and salt. Isolated rocky butts were splendidly painted in ochre, amber, umber, and gray. North of the trackless Humboldt Sink, where the Humboldt River simply vanished into the thirsty earth, were more streams, as well as the Humboldt itself, and here the forbidding land featured some contrastingly fertile valleys with lush grasses and trees, cottonwoods, willows, though not in profusion. Adequate water meant communities and agriculture, but even in the hospitable valleys, the settlements were small, the grip of civilization tenuous. As always, Dom was humbled by the vastness of the West. But the landscape also aroused new feelings this time, a sense of mystery and an unsettling awareness of limitless and eerie possibilities. Hurtling through this lonely realm, it was easy to believe something frightening had happened to him here. At 2:45, he stopped for gasoline and a sandwich in Winnemucca, a town of only 5,000 souls, yet by far the largest in a county of 16,000 square miles. Then I-80 turned eastward. The land rose gradually toward the rim of the Great Basin. More mountains peaked on every horizon, with snow far down their slopes, and more bunch grass appeared midst the sagebrush, where there were genuine meadows in some places, though the desert was by no means left entirely behind. At sunset, Dom pulled off the interstate at the Tranquility Motel, parked near the office, got out of the car, and was surprised by a cold wind. Having driven so long through deserts, he was psychologically prepared for heat, though he knew it was winter on the high plains. He reached into the car, grabbed a fleece-lined suede jacket, and put it on. He started toward the motel, then stopped, suddenly apprehensive. This was the place. He did not know how he knew, but he knew. Here, something strange had happened. He had stopped here on Friday evening, July 6th, the summer before last. He had found the curious isolation of the place and the majesty of the land enormously appealing and inspiring. Indeed, he had become convinced that this territory was good material for fiction, and he had decided to stay a couple of days to familiarize himself with it and to brood about story ideas suitable to the background. He had not left for Mountain View, Utah until Tuesday morning, the 10th of July. Now, he turned slowly, studying the scene in the fast-fading light, hoping to prick his memory. As he turned, he became convinced that what had happened to him here was more important than anything that would ever happen to him, anywhere, as long as he lived. The diner, with its big windows and blue neon sign, was at the western end of the complex, detached from the motel, surrounded by a large parking lot to accommodate long-haul trucks, of which 3 were in attendance. The entire length of the single-story white motel was served by a breezeway sheltered under an aluminum awning that glistened darkly with a well-kept coat of forest green enamel. The west wing had 10 rooms with glossy green doors, It was separated from the east wing by a 2-story section that housed the office on the first floor and no doubt the owner's quarters on the second. Unlike the west wing, the east wing was L-shaped with 6 rooms in the first section, 4 in the shorter arm. Dom kept turning and saw the dark sky in the east, the interstate dwindling into that gloom, then the immense and uninhabited panorama of shadowed land to the south. More plains and mountains lay in the west, where the sky above was streaked crimson by the sunset. Moment by moment, Dom's apprehension grew until he had turned in a complete circle and was looking once more at the Tranquility Grill. As if in a dream, he moved toward the diner. By the time he reached the door, his heart was hammering. He had the urge to flee. Steeling himself, he opened the door and went inside. It was a clean, well-lighted place, cozy and warm. Delicious odors filled the air: French fries, onions, fresh hamburgers sizzling on the griddle, frying ham. In dreamlike fear, he crossed to an empty table. A ketchup bottle, a squeeze bottle, mustard, a sugar bowl, salt and pepper shakers, and an ashtray were clustered in the center. He picked up the salt shaker. For a moment, he did not know why he had picked it up, but then he remembered sitting at this very table the summer before last, his first night at the Tranquility Motel. He had spilled a bit of salt and had reflexively cast a pinch of it over his shoulder, inadvertently throwing it in the face of a young woman approaching behind him. He sensed that the incident was important, but he did not know why. Because of the woman? Who had she been? A stranger, but what had she looked like? He tried to recall her face, but could not. His heart raced without apparent reason. He felt as if he were on the brink of some devastating revelation. He strove to recall additional details, but they eluded him. He put the salt shaker down. Still moving dreamily, shivering with unfocused anxiety, he crossed to the corner booth by the front windows. It was unoccupied, but Dom was sure that the young woman, having blinked the salt out of her eyelashes, had come here that other night. "Can I help you?" Dom was aware that a waitress in a yellow sweater was standing beside him and had spoken to him, but he remained spellbound by the tantalizing ascension of some terrible memory. It had not swum into view yet, but it was rising. The woman out of his past, whose face remained a blank to him, had sat in this booth, radiantly beautiful in the orange light of the sunset. "Mister, is something wrong?" The young woman had ordered dinner, and Dom had gone on with his meal, and the sunset had faded, and night had fallen, and... No! The memory swam out of the deeps, almost broke through the murky surface into light, into his consciousness. But at the last moment he recoiled from it in panic, as if he had seen the horrible face of some monstrously evil leviathan streaking toward him. Abruptly not wanting to remember, refusing, Dom loosed a wordless cry, stumbled back, turned away from the startled waitress, and ran. He was aware of people staring, aware that he was making a scene, but he did not give a damn. All he cared about was getting out. He hit the door, flung it open, and rushed out under a post-sunset black, purple, and scarlet sky. He was afraid. Afraid of the past, afraid of the future, but afraid mostly because he did not know why he was afraid. Chicago, Illinois. Brendan Cronin was saving his announcement for after dinner when Father Wyckowick, with a full belly and with a glass of brandy in hand, would be in his best mood of the day. Meanwhile, in the company of Fathers Wyckowick and Geronimo, he ate a hearty dinner, double portions of potatoes and beans and ham, disposing of a third of a loaf of homemade bread. Though he had regained his appetite, he had not regained his faith. When his belief in God had collapsed, it had left in him a terrible dark emptiness and despair. But now the despair was gone, and the emptiness, though not entirely filled, was shrinking. He was beginning to perceive that one day he might lead a meaningful life that had nothing to do with the church. For Brendan, for whom no temporal pleasures had been as enticing as the spiritual joy of the Mass, the mere contemplation of a secular life was a revolutionary development. Perhaps his despair had lifted because since Christmas he had at least journeyed along from atheism to a qualified agnosticism. Recent events had conspired to make him consider the existence of a power that, though not necessarily God, was nevertheless above nature. After dinner, Father Geronimo went upstairs to spend a few hours with the latest novel by James Blaylock, the fantasist, whom Brendan too found interesting, but whose colorful tales of bizarre fantasy creatures and even more bizarre human beings were too imaginative for a hard-nosed realist like Father Wyckowick. Adjourning to the study with Brendan, the rector said, "He writes well, but when I'm finished with one of his stories, I get the peculiar feeling that nothing's what it seems to be, and I don't like that feeling." "Maybe nothing is what it seems to be," Brendan said. The rector shook his head, and his gray hair caught the light in such a way that it looked like steel wire. "No, when I read for entertainment, I prefer it in big, solid, heavy blocks that let you grapple with the reality of life." Grinning broadly, Brendan said, "If there's a heaven, Father, and if I somehow manage to get there with you, I hope I'll have a chance to arrange a meeting between you and Walt Disney. I'd love to see you convince him that he should have spent his time animating the collected works of Dostoevsky instead of the adventures of Mickey Mouse." Laughing at himself, the rector poured their drinks, and they settled into armchairs, the fallen priest with a glass of schnapps, his superior with a small brandy. Deciding there would be no better time for his news, Brendan said, "If it's all right with you, I'll be going away for a while, Father. I'd like to leave on Monday if I can. I need to go to Nevada." "Nevada?" Father Wyckowick made it sound as if his curate had just said Bangkok or Timbuktu. "Why Nevada?" With the taste of peppermint schnapps on his tongue and the scent burning his sinuses, Brendan said, "That's where I'm being called. Last night in the dream, though I still saw nothing but a brilliant light, I suddenly knew where I was, Elko County, Nevada, and I knew I must go back there in order to find an explanation for Emmy's cure and Winton's resurrection." "Back there? You've been there before?" "The summer before last, just before I came to St. Bernadette's." Upon leaving his post with Monsignor Orbella in Rome, Brendan had flown directly to San Francisco to carry out a final assignment from his Vatican mentor. He stayed 2 weeks with Bishop John Santafiore, an old friend of Orbella. The bishop was writing a book on the history of papal selection, and Brendan came laden with research material provided by the Monsignor in Rome. It was his job to answer any questions about those documents. John Santafiore was a charming man with a sly, dry wit, and the days flashed past. His task concluded, Brendan was left with 2 weeks to himself before he was required to report to his superiors in Chicago, his hometown, where he would be assigned as curate to some parish in that archdiocese. He spent a few days in Carmel on the Monterey Peninsula. Then, making up his mind to see some of the country that he had never seen before, Brendan set out on a long drive eastward in a rental car. Now, Father Wyckowick leaned forward, brandy snifter clasped in both hands. "I remembered about Bishop Santafiore, but I'd forgotten you drove from there to here. And you passed through Elko County, Nevada?" "Stayed there, at a motel in the middle of nowhere, Tranquility Motel. I stopped for the night, but it was so peaceful, the countryside so beautiful, that I stayed a few days. Now I've got to go back." "Why? What happened to you out there?" Brendan shrugged. "Nothing. I just relaxed, napped, read a couple books, watched TV. They have good TV reception, even way out there, 'cause they've got their own little receiver dish on the roof. Father Waxit cocked his head. What's wrong? There for a moment you sounded odd, wooden, as if repeating something you'd memorized. I was just telling you what it was like. So if nothing happened to you there, why is the place so special? What will happen when you go back there? I'm not sure, but it's going to be something incredible. Finally revealing his frustration with his curate's obtuseness, Father Waxit put the question bluntly. Is it God calling you? I don't think so, but maybe, a slim maybe. Father, I want your permission to go, but if I can't have your blessing, I'll go anyway. Father Waxit took a larger swallow of brandy than was his habit. I think you should go, but I don't think you should go alone. Brendan was surprised. Do you want to come with me? Not me. I've got St. Bet's to run. But you should be in the company of a qualified witness, a priest familiar with these things, one who can verify any miracle or miraculous visitation. You mean some cleric who has the cardinal's imprimatur to investigate every hysterical report of weeping statues of the Holy Mother, bleeding crucifixes, and divine manifestations of all kind? Father Waxit nodded. That's right, someone who knows the process of authentication. I had in mind Monsignor Gianni of the Archdiocese's Office of Publications. He's had a lot of practice. Reluctant to disappoint his rector, but determined to proceed in his own fashion, Brendan interrupted. There's no visitation involved here, so there's no need for Monsignor Gianni. None of this has an obvious Christian significance or source. And whoever said God isn't permitted to be subtle? Father Waxit asked. His grin made it clear he expected to win this argument. These things could all be merely psychic phenomena. Bah, claptrap. Psychic phenomena are just the non-believer's pathetic explanation for glimpses of the divine hand at work. Examine these events closely, Brendan. Open your heart to the meaning of them, and you'll see the truth. God's calling you back to his bosom, and I believe a divine visitation is what this may be building toward. But if this is building to a divine manifestation, why couldn't it happen right here? Why is it necessary to go all the way to Nevada? Perhaps it's a test of your obedience to the will of God, a test of your underlying desire to believe again. If your desire is strong enough, you'll discomfort yourself by taking this long journey, and as a reward, you'll be shown something to make you believe again. But why Nevada? Why not Florida or Texas or Istanbul? Only God knows. And why would God go to all this trouble to recapture the heart of one fallen priest? To him who made the earth and stars, this is no trouble at all, and one heart is as important to him as 1,000,000 hearts. Then why did he let me lose my faith in the first place? Perhaps losing and regaining is a tempering process. You may have been put through it because God needs you to be stronger. Brendan smiled and shook his head in admiration. You're never caught without an answer, are you, Father? Looking self-satisfied, Stefan Waxit settled back in his chair. God blessed me with a quick tongue. Brendan was aware of Father Waxit's reputation as a savior of troubled priests, and he knew the rector would not give up easily, or at all. But Brendan was determined not to go to Nevada with Monsignor Gianni in tow. From the other armchair, over the rim of his brandy snifter, Father Waxit watched Brendan with evident affection and iron determination, waiting eagerly for another argument that he could swiftly refute, for another thrust that he could parry with his unfailing Jesuitical aplomb. Brendan sighed. It was going to be a long evening. Elko County, Nevada. After hurrying out of the Tranquility Grill in fear and confusion into the last fading scarlet and purple light of dusk, Dom Corvasis went directly to the motel office. There he walked into the middle of a scene that initially appeared to be a domestic quarrel, though he quickly saw that it was something stranger than that. A squarely built man in tan slacks and a brown sweater stood in the center of the room, this side of the counter. He was only 2 inches taller than Dom, but in other dimensions he was considerably larger. He seemed to have been hewn from massive slabs of oak. The gray of his brush-cut hair, the weathered lines of his face indicated he was in his 50s, although his bull-strong body had a younger presence and power. The big man was shaking, as if enraged. A woman stood beside him, staring up at him with an odd and urgent expression. She was a blonde with vivid blue eyes, younger than him, though it was difficult to judge her age. The man's pale face was shiny with sweat. As Dom stepped across the threshold, he realized that his flash impression was wrong. This guy was not enraged, but terrified. "Relax," the woman said. "Try to control your breathing." The big man was gasping. He stood with his thick neck bent, head lowered, shoulders hunched, staring at the floor. Inhalation following exhalation in an arrhythmic pattern that betrayed a growing panic. "Take deep, slow breaths," the woman said. "Remember what Dr. Fontaine taught you? When you're calm, we'll go outside for a walk." "No," the big man said, shaking his head violently. "Yes, we will," the woman said, putting a reassuring hand on his arm. "We'll go outside for a walk, Ernie, and you'll see that this darkness is no different from the darkness in Milwaukee." Ernie. The name chilled Dom and immediately brought to mind those 4 posters of the moon on which names had been scrawled in Zebediah Lomax's living room in Reno. The woman glanced at Dom and he said, "I need a room." "We're full," she said. "The vacancy sign is lit." "Okay," she said. "Okay, but not now. Please, not now. Go over to the diner or something. Come back in half an hour. Please." Until that exchange, Ernie had seemed unaware of Dom's intrusion. Now he looked up from the floor and a moan of fear and despair escaped him. "The door. Close it before the darkness comes in." "No, no, no," the woman told him, her voice firm yet full of compassion. "It's not coming in. Darkness can't hurt you, Ernie." "It's coming in," he insisted miserably. Dom realized that the room was unnaturally bright. Table lamps, a floor lamp, a desk lamp, and the ceiling fixtures blazed. The woman turned to Dom again. "For God's sake, close the door." He stepped in rather than out and shut the door behind him. "I meant close it as you leave," the woman said pointedly. The expression on Ernie's face was part terror, part embarrassment. His eyes shifted from Dom to the window. "It's right there at the glass. All the darkness. Pressing, pressing." He looked sheepishly at Dom, then lowered his head again, shut his eyes tight. Dom stood transfixed. Ernie's irrational fear was horribly like the terror which drove Dom to walk in his sleep and to hide in closets. Using anger to repress her tears, the woman turned to Dom. "Why won't you go? He's nyctophobic. He's afraid of the dark sometimes. And when he has one of these attacks, we have to work it out together." Dom remembered the other names scrawled on the posters in Lomax's house. Ginger, Faye, and he chose one by instinct. "It's all right, Faye. I think I understand a little of what you're going through." She blinked in surprise when he used her name. "Do I know you?" "Do you? I'm Dominic Corvasis." "Means nothing to me," she said, staying with the big man as he turned and, eyes still closed, shuffled toward the back of the office. Ernie moved blindly toward the gate in the counter. "Got to get upstairs, where I can pull the drapes, keep the dark out." Faye said, "No, Ernie, wait. Don't run from it." Stepping in front of Ernie, putting a hand on the man's chest to halt him, Dom said, "You have nightmares. When you wake up, you can't remember what they were, except they had something to do with the moon." Faye gasped. Ernie opened his eyes in surprise. "How'd you know that?" "I've had nightmares for over a month," Dom said, "every night, and I know a man who suffered from them so bad he killed himself." They stared at him in astonishment. "In October," Dom said, "I started walking in my sleep. I'd creep out of bed, hide in closets, or gather weapons to protect myself. Once I tried to nail the window shut to keep something out. Don't you see, Ernie, I'm afraid of something in the dark. I'll bet that's what you're afraid of too. Not just the dark itself, but something else, something specific that happened to you." He gestured toward the windows, "out there in the darkness on that same weekend, the summer before last." Still baffled by this turn of events, Ernie glanced at the night beyond the windows, then immediately looked away. "I don't understand." "Let's go upstairs where you can draw the drapes," Dom said. "I'll tell you what I know. The important thing is you aren't alone in this. You're not alone anymore, and thank God, neither am I." New Haven County, Connecticut. Clockwork. Jack Twist's heists always ticked along like clockwork mechanisms. The armored car job was no exception. The night was solidly roofed with clouds, no stars, no moon. No snow was falling, but a cold, moist wind swept up from the southwest. The guardmaster truck rumbled past empty fields coming from the northeast toward the knoll from which Jack had watched at Christmas Eve. Its headlights bored through thin, ragged sheets of patchy winter fog. In the snow-wrapped fields, a county lane resembled a strip of black satin ribbon. Dressed in a white ski suit with hood, Jack lay half buried in snow south of the roadway, across from the knoll. On the other side of the road, at the foot of the knoll, the second member of the team, Chad Zepp, also in white camouflage, sprawled in another drift. The third member of the team, Branch Pollard, was halfway down the knoll with a Heckler & Koch HK-91 heavy assault rifle. The truck was 200 yards away. Refracting the headlights, fog formations drifted across the road into the lightless fields. Suddenly, the muzzle of the HK-91 flashed up on the hillside. A shot cracked above the sound of the grinding engine. The HK-91, perhaps the finest combat rifle made, could fire hundreds of rounds without jamming. Extremely accurate, effective at 1,000 yards, the HK-91 could put a 7.62 NATO round through a tree or a concrete wall with sufficient punch left to kill someone on the other side. Tonight, however, they did not intend to kill anyone. Aided by an infrared telescopic sight, Pollard put the first shot where he wanted it, blowing out the right front tire of the guardmaster transport. The truck swerved wildly. Encountering ice, it began to slide. Even while the armored transport was sliding, its fate unsettled, Jack was up and running. He leaped a ditch and dashed onto the road in front of the vehicle, which loomed like a tank. At the last moment, when it seemed bound inexorably for the ditch, the driver regained control and brought the truck to a jerky halt 30 feet from Jack. He saw one of the guardmaster crewmen talking excitedly into a radio handset. That call for help was futile. The moment Pollard had fired from the knoll, Chad Zepp, still concealed in the snow north of the road, had switched on a battery-powered transmitter, jamming the transport's radio frequency with shrill electronic static. As the rising wind harried fog ghosts past Jack, he stood in the middle of the road, feeling naked in the blazing headlights, taking time to aim the tear gas rifle at the truck's grill. The gun was of British manufacture, designed for anti-terrorist squads. Other tear gas weapons fired grenades that spewed disabling fumes on impact, requiring the marksman to aim at windows, but upon seizing an embassy, terrorists usually boarded up the windows. The new British gun, which Jack had acquired from a black market arms dealer in Miami, had a 2-inch bore and fired a high-velocity, steel-jacketed tear gas shell that could penetrate most wooden doors or punch through a boarded window. When Jack fired, the shell smashed through the truck's grill into the engine compartment. A noxious yellow vapor began rolling into the cab by way of its ventilation system. The guards had been trained to remain in their secure roost in a crisis, for the cab had steel doors and bulletproof glass. But when they switched off the heater and closed the vents too late, they found themselves choking in the gas-filled cabin. They opened their locked doors, spilled out into the cold winter night, wheezing, coughing. In spite of the blinding, suffocating gas, the driver had drawn his revolver. Dropping to his knees, gagging, he squinted his copiously watering eyes in search of a target. But Jack kicked the gun out of his hand, grabbed him by the coat, and dragged him to the front of the truck, where he handcuffed him to a support strut on the bumper. After firing the shot that disabled the truck, Branch Pollard had sprinted down the knoll. Now, at the other end of the front bumper, he handcuffed the other protesting guard to another strut. Both guards were blinking furiously, trying to clear their gas-blurred vision to get a look at their attackers' faces, but that was wasted effort because Jack, Pollard, and Zepp were wearing ski masks. Leaving the securely shackled men, Jack and Pollard ran to the back of the truck, moving fast, though not because they feared being seen by other traffic on that lonely road. No traffic would pass until they were gone. The moment the guardmaster unit had entered the flats, the last two members of the robbery team, Hart and Dodd, had sealed off both ends of the road with stolen vans that had been repainted and equipped with Department of Highway signs. Against an impressive backdrop of emergency beacons flashing on the roofs of their vans and on sawhorses they had set out on the pavement, Dodd and Hart would turn back everyone who wanted through, spinning a tale of tanker truck accident. Clockwork. When Jack and Pollard got to the rear of the truck, Chad Zepp was already there. In the glow of a battery-powered light that he had fixed to the truck with a magnet, Zepp was unscrewing the faceplate that covered the lock mechanism on the doors to the cargo hold. They had brought explosives, but when trying to peel a truck as well constructed as the guardmaster, there was a risk that explosives would fuse the lock pins, sealing the honeypot even tighter. They had to try going in through the lock, leaving explosives as a last resort. Some older armored cars had locks that operated with a key or pair of keys, and some had combination dials, but this was a new vehicle with state-of-the-art equipment. This lock was engaged and disengaged by pressing a sequence of code numbers on a 10-digit keyboard that was the size and appearance of the dial on a touch-tone telephone. To activate the lock, the guard closed the doors and simply punched in the middle number of the 3-number code. To deactivate it, he pressed all 3 numbers in the correct order. The code was changed every morning, and of the 2 men crewing the truck, only the driver knew it. There were 1,000 possible 3-number sequences in 10 digits. Because it would take between 4 and 5 seconds to key in each sequence and wait for it to be accepted or rejected, they would have to delay at least an hour and a quarter to try every combination. That was far too risky. Chad Zepp removed the faceplate from the lock. The 10 numbered buttons remained, but now it was possible to see a bit of the mechanism between and behind them. Hung on a strap from Zepp's shoulder was a battery-powered, attaché-sized computer which could assess and control the circuitry of electronic locks and alarms. It was SLICS, an acronym for Security Lock Intervention and Circumvention Knowledge System. Intended solely for military or intelligence agency personnel with security passes, SLICS was unavailable to the public. Unauthorized possession was a criminal violation of the Defense Security Act. To obtain a SLICS, Jack had gone to Mexico City and had paid $25,000 to a black market arms dealer who had a contact inside the firm that manufactured the device. Zepp unslung the computer and held it so he and Jack and Pollard could see the 4-inch square video display, which was dark. 3 retractable probes were slotted in the SLICS, and Jack withdrew the first of these from its niche. It looked like a copper-tipped steel thermometer on a 2-foot wire umbilical. Jack looked closely at the partially exposed guts of the electronic lock and carefully inserted the slender probe between the first 2 buttons, touching it to the contact point at the base of the button marked 1. The display screen remained dark. He moved the probe to button number 2, then 3. Nothing. But when he touched number 4, a pale green word, current, appeared on the screen, plus numbers that measured trace electricity in the contact. This meant that the middle number of the 3-digit lock code was 4. After loading sacks of money and checks into the cargo hold at the last stop on the route, the driver had pushed forward to activate the lock. The contact point of that button would remain closed until the entire code was punched in, thereby unlocking the door. With 3 unknown numbers, the possible combinations had been 1,000, but now that they needed to find only the first and last numbers, the search was reduced to 100 combinations. Ignoring the howling wind, Jack withdrew another instrument from the slicks. This was also on a 2-foot cord, but resembled a watercolor brush, though with a single bristle. The bristle glowed with light and was thicker than a 60-pound fishing line, stiff yet flexible. Jack inserted it into a crack at the base of the 1 button on the lock keyboard, glanced at the computer video display, but was not rewarded. He moved the bristle probe from number to number. The display screen blinked, then showed a partial diagram of a circuit board. The bristle that he had thrust inside the mechanism was actually the end filament of an optical laser, a more sophisticated cousin of the similar device which, in supermarket cash registers, read the barcodes on grocery items. The Slicks was not programmed to read barcodes, but to recognize circuitry patterns and render models of them on the display screen. The screen would register nothing whatsoever until the bristle probe was aimed directly at a circuit or a portion thereof, but then it would faithfully reproduce the hidden pattern that it saw. Jack had to move the probe 3 times, insert it into the lock mechanism at 3 different points, before the computer was able to piece together a picture of the entire circuitry from partial views. The diagram glowed in bright green lines and symbols on the miniature video display. After 3 seconds of consideration, the computer drew boxes around 2 small portions of the diagram to indicate those points at which a tap could easily be applied to the circuitry. Then it superimposed an image of the 10-digit keyboard over the diagram to show where those 2 weak points were in relation to that portion of the lock mechanism that was visible to Jack. "There's a good tap-in spot below the number 4 button. You need me to drill," Jack said. "You need me to drill?" Pollard asked. "I don't think so." Jack returned the optical probe to its slot and withdrew a 3rd slender instrument with a spongy mesh tip of some material he could not identify, which the designer of Slicks had labeled the tap wand. He inserted it through the tiny gap in the lock mechanism at the base of the 4 button, slowly moved it up and down, left and right, until the computer beeped and flashed intervention on the miniature video display. While Jack held the tap wand in place and Chad Zepp held the Slicks upright, Pollard used the computer's small programming board to quickly type instructions. Intervention disappeared, and onto the screen came other words: "System control established." The computer could now feed commands directly to the microchip that processed the lock codes and that directed the sliding steel bolts to either close or open. Pollard hit 2 more keys and the Slicks began to send sequences of 3 numbers to the microchip, 1 combination every 600th of a second, all of which used the already known 4 as the middle digit of the code. Slicks hit the right code, 545, in only 9 seconds. With 4 simultaneous thumps, the lock bolts retracted as 1. Jack returned the tap wand to its niche, switched off the computer. Only 4 minutes had passed since the rifle shot that had blown out the truck's right front tire. Clockwork. As Zepp slung the Slicks over his shoulder again, Pollard opened the rear doors of the armored car. The money was theirs for the taking. Zepp laughed with delight. With a gleeful whoop, Pollard clambered into the truck and began to push out bulging canvas bags. But Jack still felt empty and cold inside. A few snow flurries suddenly appeared in the wind. The unexplained change in Jack, which had begun weeks ago, had now reached completion. He no longer cared about getting even with society. He felt purposeless, as adrift as the wind-borne flakes of snow. Elko County, Nevada. Faye Block had turned on the no vacancy notice to ensure that they would not be disturbed. Sitting around the table in the cheery kitchen of their apartment above the motel office, with the blinds shut against the night, the Blocks sipped coffee and listened spellbound as Dom told his story. The only point at which they registered disbelief was when he told them of the impossible dance of paper moons in Zebediah Lomax's house in Reno. But he was able to describe that startling event in such sharp detail that he felt goose flesh pimpling his arms, and he saw that his own awe and fear were being transmitted to Faye and Ernie. They appeared most impressed by the 2 Polaroid photographs that had arrived in the mail from the unknown correspondent 2 days before Dom had flown to Portland. They studied the picture in which the zombie-faced priest was sitting at a writing desk, and they were certain it had been taken in one of their motel rooms. The photo of the blonde in bed with an IV line in her arm was a close-up that showed nothing of the room, but they recognized the floral pattern bedspread visible in one corner of the shot. It was a kind that had been in use in some units until 10 months ago. To Dom's surprise, they had been sent a similar photograph. Ernie remembered receiving it in a plain envelope on December 10th, 5 days before they had flown to Milwaukee. Faye got it from the center drawer of the desk in the downstairs office, and they hunched conspiratorially over the kitchen table, studying the print. It was a shot of 3 people, man, woman, child, standing in sunshine by the door to room 9. All 3 were dressed in short t-shirts and sandals. "Do you recognize them?" Dom asked. "No," Faye said. "But I feel like I ought to remember them," Ernie said. Dom said sunshine, summer clothes, so we can almost certainly conclude it was taken the summer before last, that weekend, between Friday the 6th of July and the following Tuesday. These 3 people were part of whatever happened, maybe innocent victims like us, and our unknown correspondent wants us to think about them, remember them. Ernie said whoever sent the pictures would have been one of the people who erased our memories. So why would he want to stir us up like this after so much trouble was taken to make us forget? Dom shrugged. Maybe he never believed it was right, what was done to us. Maybe he only went along with it because he had to, and maybe it's been on his conscience ever since. Whoever he is, he's afraid to come right out with what he knows. He's got to do it indirectly. Abruptly, Faye pushed her chair back from the table. 5 weeks of mail piled up while we were away. Might be something more in it. As the sound of Faye's descending footsteps echoed up from the stairs, Ernie said, "Sandy, that's our waitress at the grill, sorted through the mail and paid the bills as they arrived, but the rest of the mail she just dropped in a paper sack. Since we came back this morning, we've been so busy getting the place open, we didn't bother looking to see what the postman brought." Faye returned with 2 plain white envelopes. In a state of high excitement, they opened the first. It contained a Polaroid of a man lying on his back in bed, an intravenous needle in his arm. He was in his 50s, dark hair, balding. In ordinary circumstances, he probably had a jovial look, for he resembled W.C. Fields, but he was staring blankly toward the camera, face bleak, zombie eyes. "My God, it's Calvin," Faye said. "Yeah," Ernie said. "Cal Sharkle. He's a long-haul trucker moving freight between Chicago and San Francisco. He stops at the grill most every trip," Faye said. "Sometimes when he's beat, he stays overnight. Calvin's such a nice man." "What companies he drive for?" Dom asked. "He's independent," Ernie said. "Owns his own rig." "Would you know how to get in touch with him?" "Well," Ernie said, "he signs a registry every time he checks in, so we'll have his address. Around Chicago somewhere, I think. We'll check later. First, let's look in that other envelope." Faye opened it and produced another Polaroid. Again, it was the shot of a man lying in one of the Tranquility Motel's beds, an IV line in one arm. Like all the others, he had no expression whatsoever, and soulless eyes that reminded Dom of horror movies about the living dead. But this time they all recognized the man in the bed. It was Dom. Las Vegas, Nevada. When Marcy's bedtime came, she was sitting at the little desk in the corner of her room, occupied with her collection of moons. Georgia stood in the doorway watching. The girl was so thoroughly engaged by the task that she remained unaware she was being observed. A box of crayons lay beside the album full of moons. Marcy was hunched over the work surface, carefully coloring one of the lunar faces. This was a new development, and Georgia wondered what it meant. In the weeks since Marcy had begun her collection with magazine clippings, she had filled the album. She had few sources for photos, so she drew hundreds of pictures to add to the monotonous gallery. Using templates as varied as coins, jar lids, vases, drinking glasses, cans, and thimbles, she traced lunar forms of all sizes on tablet paper, construction paper, paper bags, envelopes, and wrapping paper. She did not spend most of her time with the album, but each day she devoted a bit more time to it than she had the day before. Dr. Ted Coverly, the psychologist treating Marcy, believed the anxiety that had generated the girl's irrational fear of doctors had not been relieved. Now the child was expressing that anxiety through her lunar preoccupation. When Georgia noted that Marcy did not seem to be particularly frightened of the moon, Coverly said, "Well, her anxiety doesn't have to seek expression in another phobia. It can show itself in other ways, such as an obsession." Georgia could not understand where her daughter's extraordinary anxiety came from. Coverly said, "That's why the therapy, to seek understanding. Don't worry, Miss Monatella." But Georgia was worried. She was worried because Alan had killed himself only yesterday. Georgia had not yet told Marcy of her father's death. On leaving Pepper Carafield's apartment, she had called Coverly to ask his advice. He was astonished to learn that Alan, too, had been dreaming of the moon and had independently developed an intense lunar fascination of his own. That one would take time to ponder. Meanwhile, Coverly thought it wise to withhold the bad news from Marcy until Monday. "Come with her to the appointment. We'll tell her together." Georgia was afraid that, in spite of Alan's inattention, Marcy would be devastated by his death. As she stood in the bedroom doorway, watching Marcy diligently applying a crayon to one of the moons, Georgia was stricken by an acute awareness of the girl's fragility. Although she was 7 years old and in second grade, the 3/4 scale chair was still too big for her, and only the toes of her sneakers touched the floor. Even for a macho man armored with muscles, life was tenuous, and every additional day of existence was against the odds. But for a child as petite as Marcy, continued life seemed downright miraculous. Georgia realized how easily her precious daughter could be taken from her, and her heart swelled and ached with love. When at last Georgia said, "Honey, better put your pajamas on and brush your teeth," she could not keep a tremor out of her voice. The girl looked bewildered, as if she were not quite sure where she was or who Georgia was. Then her eyes cleared, and she gave her mother a smile that could melt butter. "Hi, Mommy. I've been coloring moons." "Well, now it's time to get ready for bed," Georgia said. "In a little while, okay?" The girl appeared to be relaxed, yet she was gripping a crayon so tightly that her knuckles were white. "I want to color some more moons." Georgia wanted to destroy the hateful album, but Dr. Coverly had warned that arguing with the child about the moons and forbidding her to collect them would only strengthen her obsession. Georgia was not sure he was right, but she stifled the urge to destroy the album. "Tomorrow you'll have lots of time to color, Peanut." Reluctantly, Marcy closed the album, put away her crayons, and went to the bathroom to brush her teeth. Alone beside the child's desk, Georgia was overcome by weariness. In addition to working a full shift, she'd arranged a mortician for Alan's body, ordered flowers, and settled details with the cemetery for Monday's funeral. She had also called Alan's estranged father in Miami to break the bad news. She was drained. Wearily, she opened the album. Red. The girl was coloring all the moons red, both those she had drawn and those clipped from newspapers and magazines. She had already painted more than 50 lunar images. The obsessive quality of the girl's work was evident. In the great care she had taken to keep the crayon from slipping past the outline of each moon, the crayon had been applied more heavily picture by picture until some moons were coated with so much scarlet wax that they had a glisteningly wet look. The use of red and red alone profoundly disturbed Georgia. It almost seemed as if Marcy had glimpsed an augury of some onrushing terror, a premonition of blood. Elko County, Nevada. Faye Block had gone downstairs to the file cabinets from which she had extracted the motel registry that had been in use the summer before last. Upon her return, she put the book on the kitchen table in front of Dom, open to the guest lists of Friday and Saturday, July 6 and 7. There, just like Ernie and I remembered, that Friday was the night they closed the interstate because of a toxic spill. A truckload of dangerous chemicals headed out to Schenkfield. There's a military installation about 18 miles southwest of here. We had to close the motel until Tuesday until they got the situation under control. Ernie said Schenkfield's an isolated testing ground for chemical and biological weapons, so the crap in that truck was damn nasty. Faye continued, a new wooden note in her voice, as if reciting carefully memorized lines. They erected roadblocks and ordered us to evacuate the danger zone. Our guests left in their own cars. Her face remained expressionless. Ned and Sandy Sarver were allowed to go up to their trailer near Beowulf because it was outside the quarantine area. Astonished and confused, Dom said, "Impossible. I don't remember any evacuation. I was here. I remember reading, researching the geography for a series of short stories. But those memories are so thin I suspect they aren't real, no substance to them. Still, I was here and nowhere else, and something weird was done to me." He indicated the Polaroid snapshot of himself. "There's the proof." When Faye spoke, she sounded stiffer than before, and Dom saw a strangeness in her eyes, a slightly glazed look. "Until the all-clear was given, Ernie and I stayed with friends who have a small ranch in the mountains 10 miles northeast of here. Elroy and Nancy Jameson. It was a difficult spill to clean up. The Army needed more than 3 days to do the job. They wouldn't let us back here until Tuesday morning." "What's wrong with you, Faye?" Dom asked. She blinked. "Huh? What do you mean?" "You sound as if you'd been programmed with that little speech." She seemed genuinely baffled. "What are you talking about?" Frowning, Ernie said, "Faye, your voice went flat." "Well, I was only explaining what happened." She leaned over and put one finger on Friday's page of the registry. "See? We'd rented out 11 rooms by the time they closed the interstate that night, but nobody paid for the rooms because nobody stayed. They were evacuated." "There's your name, 7th on the list," Ernie said. Dom stared at his signature and at the Mountain View, Utah address to which he had been moving at the time. He could remember checking in, but he sure as hell could not remember climbing back into his car and driving out the same night in response to an evacuation order. He said, "Did you actually see the accident, the tanker truck?" Ernie shook his head. "No, the truck overturned a couple miles from here." He spoke in that rote tone that had marked Faye's speech. The Army experts from Schenkfield were concerned the chemicals would be dispersed by the wind, so the quarantine zone was very large. Chilled by the unconscious artificiality in Ernie's voice, Dom looked at Faye and saw that she too had noticed her husband's unnatural tone. He said, "That's what you sounded like a moment ago, Faye." He looked at Ernie. "You two have been programmed with the same script." Faye frowned. "Are you saying the spill never happened?" "It happened, all right," Ernie told Dom. "For a while, we saved a bunch of newspaper clippings about it from the Elko Sentinel, but I think we eventually threw them out. Anyway, people around these parts still wonder what might have happened if we'd gotten big winds and been contaminated with that top-secret stuff before the evacuation order was even given. No, it's not just some delusion of Faye's and mine. You can ask Elroy and Nancy Jameson, Faye said. They were here that night visiting. When we had to evacuate, they offered to take us back to their place and put us up for the duration. Dom smiled sourly. I wouldn't put much credence in their recall of events. If they were here, then they saw what the rest of us saw, and it was scrubbed from their minds. They remembered taking you back to their place because that's what they were told to remember. In fact, they were probably right here being brainwashed with the rest of us. My head's swimming, Faye said. This is positively Byzantine. But damn it, the toxic spill and evacuation happened, Ernie said. It was in the newspapers. Dom thought of a disturbing explanation that made his scalp crawl. What if everyone here at the motel that night was contaminated with some chemical or biological weapon headed for Schenkfield? And what if the army and the government covered it up to avoid bad press, millions of dollars in lawsuits, and the disclosure of top-secret information? Maybe they closed the highway and announced that everyone was safely evacuated, when in fact we had not been gotten out in time. Then they used the motel as a clinic, decontaminated us as much as they could, scrubbed the memory of the incident out of our minds, and reprogrammed us with false memories so we'd never know what had happened to us. They stared at one another in shocked silence for a moment, not because the scenario sounded entirely right, which it did not, but because it was the first scenario they'd come up with that made sense of the psychological problems they had been having and explained the drug people in those Polaroid snapshots. Then Ernie and Faye began to think of objections. Ernie voiced the first. In that case, the logical thing for them to have done was to make our false memories tie in closely with their cover story about the toxic spill and evacuation. That's exactly what they did with Faye and me, with the Jamesons, Ned and Sandy Sarver. So why didn't they do the same with you? Why'd they program you with different memories that didn't have anything to do with the evacuation? That was irrational and risky. I mean, the radical differences between our memories is virtually proof that you or we or all of us were brainwashed. Don't know, Dom said. That's just one more mystery to unravel. And here's another flaw in that theory, Ernie said. If we'd been contaminated by a biological weapon, they wouldn't have let us go in just 3 days. They'd have been afraid of contagion, epidemic. Dom said, all right. So it was a chemical agent, not a virus or bacterium, something they could wash off or flush out of our systems. That doesn't make sense either, Faye said, because the things they test at Schenkfield are meant to be deadly. Poison gas, nerve gas, hideous damn stuff. If we'd got caught in a cloud like that, we'd have been dead on the spot or brain damaged or crippled. Maybe it was a slow-acting agent, Tom said, something that generates tumors, leukemia, or other conditions that only begin to show up 2 or 3 or 5 years from the date of contamination. That thought also shocked them into silence. They listened to the ticking of the kitchen clock, to the mournful fluting of the wind at the windows, wondering if malignancies were even now sprouting within them. Finally, Ernie said, maybe we were contaminated and maybe we're all slowly rotting inside, but I don't think so. After all, they test potential weapons at Schenkfield, and what use would a weapon be that didn't kill the enemy for years and years? Virtually no use at all, Dom acknowledged. And, Ernie said, how could chemical contamination explain that bizarre experience you had in Lomax's house in Reno? I have no idea, Dom said, but now that we know they cordoned off this whole area using the excuse of a toxic spill, whether it was a real spill or not, my theory that we were brainwashed is a lot more credible. Before this, I wasn't able to explain how someone could have rounded us up at will and held us long enough to make us forget the thing we saw. But the quarantine gave them the time they needed, and it also kept away prying eyes. So at least now we have a good idea who we're up against. The United States Army, maybe acting in collusion with the government, maybe acting alone, has been trying to hide something that happened here, something it did but shouldn't have done. I don't know about you, but the thought of being up against an enemy that big and that potentially ruthless scares the hell out of me. An old leatherneck like me is bound to be scornful of the army, Ernie said, but they're not devils, you know. We can't leap to the conclusion we're victims of a wicked right-wing conspiracy. That crackpot stuff makes millions for paranoid novelists and for Hollywood. But in the real world, evil is more subtle, less identifiable. If army and government officials are behind what happened to us, they don't necessarily have immoral motives. They probably think they did the only wise thing they could have done in the circumstances. But whether or not it's wise, Faye said, we've got to dig into this situation. If we don't, Ernie's nyctophobia will surely get worse, and your sleepwalking will also get worse, Dom. And what then? They all knew what then. What then was the shotgun barrel jammed in the mouth, the route to peace that Zebediah Lomack had taken. Dom looked down at the motel registry on the table before him. 4 spaces above his own name, he saw another entry that electrified him. Dr. Ginger Weiss. Her address was in Boston. Ginger, he said, the 4th name on those moon posters. Furthermore, Cal Sharkle, the block's trucker friend from Chicago, the zombie-eyed subject of one of the Polaroid snapshots, had checked into the motel just before Dr. Weiss. The first guests to sign in that day were Mr. and Mrs. Alan Rykoff and daughter of Las Vegas. Dom was willing to bet that they were the young family photographed in front of the door to room 9. Zebediah Lomack's name was not in the registry, so he had probably just been unlucky enough to stop at the grill for dinner that night on his way between Reno and Elko. One of the other names might have been that of the young priest in the other Polaroid, but if so, he had signed without appending his title. We'll have to talk to all these people, Dom said excitedly. We can start calling them first thing tomorrow and see what they remember about those days in July. Chicago, Illinois. By allowing no slightest hairline crack to appear in his resolve, by showing no equivocation whatsoever, Brendan managed to obtain Father Wyckoff's permission to go to Nevada alone on Monday, without Monsignor Gianni trailing him in expectation of miracles. By 10:10, he was in bed with the lights out, lying on his side in blackness, staring at the window, where the palest light glistered softly in the frost that skinned the pane. The window looked out upon the courtyard where no lights burned at this hour, so Brendan knew that he was seeing indirect moonglow, refracted by the thin layer of ice that had welded itself to the glass. It had to be indirect light because the moon was traversing the sky on a course that had made it visible from the study windows earlier in the evening, and the study was on the other side of the rectory. The moon could not now be over the courtyard unless it had made a sudden 90-degree turn in the path it had previously been following, which was not possible. As he patiently lay waiting for sleep, he became increasingly intrigued by the subtle patterns made by the second-hand moonbeams that had been trapped in the frost. Light splintered at every point where one ice crystal interfaced with another, each beam shattering into 100 beams, 100 more. "The moon," he whispered, surprised by his voice. "The moon." Gradually, Brendan realized that something uncanny was happening. At first, he was merely fascinated by the harmonious interaction of frost and moonlight, but soon fascination evolved into a more intense attraction. He could not look away from the pearly window. It offered an indefinable promise, and he was drawn as a sailor by a siren's song. Before he knew what he intended, he had slipped one arm out from beneath the blankets and was reaching toward the window, though it was 10 feet away and could not be touched from where he lay. The black silhouette of his spread-fingered hand was clearly defined against the niveous pane of glass that glowed softly beyond, and his futile straining was the essence of yearning. Brandon longed to be within the light, not the light that lived in the frost, but that other golden light of his dreams. "The moon," he whispered, again surprised that he had spoken. His heartbeat accelerated. He began to tremble. Suddenly, upon the glass, the sugary-looking frost underwent an inexplicable change. As Brandon watched, the thin rime melted away from the edges of the pane toward the center. In a few seconds, when the melting stopped, there remained only a perfect circle of ice, about 10 inches in diameter, glowing eerily in the middle of an otherwise clear, dry, dark rectangle of glass. The moon. Brandon knew it was a sign, though he did not know from whom or what or where it came, nor did he understand it. On Christmas night, when he had stayed at his parents' house in Bridgeport, Brandon had apparently had a dream featuring the moon, for he had awakened his mother and father with his loud and panicky cries. But he could remember nothing of the dream. Since then, as far as he knew, none of his dreams had involved the moon, but were concerned exclusively with that mysterious place full of dazzling golden light, where he felt himself called towards some incredible revelation. Now, as he still reached with one hand toward the glimmering frost on the window, the vaguely phosphorescent rime grew brighter, as if some peculiar chemical reaction was at work within the ice crystals. The moon image changed from a milky hue to the crisper white of sun-dappled snow, then grew even brighter until it was a scintillant circle of silver blazing on the glass. Heart pounding furiously, certain he was teetering on the edge of some astounding epiphany, Brandon continued to hold his hand toward the window, and he gasped in shock as a shaft of light leapt out from the frost moon and fell across the bed. It was like the beam of a spotlight and every bit as brilliant. As he squinted into the glare, trying to see how such fierce incandescence could possibly originate from ordinary hoarfrost and glass, the light changed to pale red, to darker red, to crimson, to scarlet. Around him the rumpled blanket shone like molten steel, and his outstretched hand appeared to be wet with blood. He was gripped by déjà vu, absolutely convinced that he had once really stood under a scarlet moon bathed in its bloody glow. Although he wanted to understand how this strange red light related to the wondrous golden light of his dreams, although he still felt himself being called by something unknown that waited in that radiance, he was suddenly afraid. As the scarlet beams intensified, as his room became a cauldron of heatless red fire and red shadows, his fear grew into terror of such power that it made him shake and sweat. He pulled his hand back, and the scarlet light rapidly faded to silver, and the silver dimmed as well, until the circle of frost on the window shone with only a natural reflection of the January moon. As darkness laid claim to his room once more, Brandon sat up and hastily switched on the lamp. Damp with sweat, as full of the night shakes as any child frightened by fantasies of carnivorous goblins, he went to the window. The icy circle was still there, a moon image in the center of the otherwise unfrosted pane of glass. He had wondered if the light had been but a dream or hallucination. In a way, he almost wished it had been only that. But the frost moon was still there, proof that what he had seen was real, not a delusion. Hesitantly, he touched the glass. He felt nothing unusual, just the bitter cold of winter pressing against the other side of the pane. With a start, he realized that he felt the swollen rings in his palms. He turned his hands over and watched as the stigmata faded. He returned to bed. For a long while he sat with his back against the headboard, with his eyes open and the light on, waiting for the courage to lie down in darkness. Elko County, Nevada. Ernie stood by the tub in the bathroom, trying to recall precisely what he had thought and felt in the early hours of Saturday, December 14, when he had been driven by some strange impulse to open the window and had suffered that frightening hallucination. The writer, Dominic Corvasis, stood by the sink, and Faye watched from the doorway. Reflections of the ceiling light and the light above the mirror imparted a warmth to the ceramic tile floor, glimmered in the chrome faucets and shower rod, gave a bright flat sheen to the plastic shower curtain, and gradually illuminated the memories that Ernie sought. Light. I came in here for the light. My fear of the dark was at a peak then, and I was trying to hide it from Faye. Couldn't sleep, so I slipped out of bed, came here, closed the door, and just sort of reveled in the light. He told how his gaze was drawn to the window above the tub and how he was overcome by an irrational and urgent need to escape. It's hard to explain, but suddenly crazy thoughts whirled into my head. For some reason I panicked. I thought, this is my one chance to escape, so I'd better take it, go through that window, head up into the hills, get to a ranch, get help. Help for what? Corvasis asked. Why did you need help? Why did you feel you needed to escape from your own home? Ernie frowned. Don't have the foggiest notion. He remembered the way he had felt that night, the eeriness, urgency strangely mixed with dreaminess. He pointed to the window. I actually slid back the bolt and opened it. Might have crawled out too, except I saw someone outside, on the roof of the utility room. Who? Corvasis asked. Sounds silly. It was a guy in motorcycle gear, white crash helmet, dark visor over his face, black gloves. In fact, he reached one hand through the window as if making a grab for me, and I stepped backward, fell over the edge of the tub. That's when I came running, Faye said. I got off the floor, Ernie said, went back to the window, looked out on the roof, no one there. It had been just hallucination. Faye said, in extreme cases of phobia, when the sufferer is in almost constant anxiety, hallucinations sometimes occur. The writer stared at the opaque window above the tub as if hoping to find some vital secret revealed in the uneven, milky texture of the glass. At last he said it wasn't exactly a hallucination. I have a hunch that what you saw, Ernie, was call it a memory flash. From the summer before last, from the lost days. For a moment, back on December 14th, your repressed memories surged toward the surface. You had a flashback to a time when you really were a prisoner in your own home, when you really did try to escape. And I was stopped by that guy on the roof of the utility room. But what was he doing there in a motorcycle helmet? Strange, isn't it? Dom said, a man in a decontamination suit sent to deal with a spill of chemicals or biological toxins would wear an airtight helmet. Decontamination, Ernie said. But if they were actually here in suits like that, then there must have really been a spill. Maybe, Dom said. We still don't know enough to decide. Faye said, but listen, if we all went through this experience like you think we did, then how come only you and Ernie and that Mr. Lomack are suffering repercussions? How come I'm not having bad dreams and psychological problems? The writer's gaze drifted back to the window. I don't know. But those are some of the questions we've got to answer if we've any hope of relieving the subconscious anxiety that this experience left in us, if we've any hope of getting on with normal lives. Connecticut to New York City. After the money had been removed from the armored car, Jack and his men drove only 9 miles and parked the 2 phony Department of Highway vans in a 4-stall rented garage leased with fake IDs where they had left their cars. The garage was one of a long row that faced both sides of a litter-strewn alley in a shabby neighborhood where relaxed zoning laws permitted intermingling of commercial and industrial facilities with residences. The area was characterized by peeling paint, grime, broken street lamps, empty storefronts, and mean-looking mongrel dogs on the loose. They emptied the contents of the canvas bags on the oily concrete floor of the garage and did a hasty count of the cash. They split it quickly into 5 shares of approximately $350,000 each, all in used bills that could never be traced. Jack felt no triumph, no thrill, nothing. In 5 minutes, the gang had dispersed like dandelion fluff on a brisk wind. Clockwork. As Jack headed home to Manhattan, spits of snow fell in brief squalls, though not enough to dust the highway or interfere with travel. During the drive from Connecticut, in a strange mood, he underwent a change he could not have anticipated. Minute by minute and mile by mile, the grayness in him began at last to be colored by emotion. His ennui gave way to feelings that surprised him. He would not have been surprised by a new welling up of grief or loneliness, for Jenny had been dead only 17 days. But the emotion that steadily tightened its grip on him was guilt. The stolen money in the trunk of the car began to weigh on his conscience as heavily as if it were the first ill-gotten goods ever to fall into his hands. Through 8 busy years of meticulously planned and triumphantly executed larcenies, several on an even grander scale than the armored car, he had never experienced the mildest quiver of guilt, until now. He had seen himself as a just avenger, until now. Cruising to Manhattan through the blustery winter night, he began to see himself as little more than a common thief. Guilt wrapped him like flypaper. He tried repeatedly to shake it off. It clung. Sudden as it seemed, the guilt had actually been building for a long time. That was where his growing dissatisfaction had been leading for months. Disillusionment had set in noticeably with the jewelry store job last October, and he thought the changes had begun then. But now, forced into self-analysis, he realized he had stopped getting a full measure of pleasure from his work long ago. As he scrolled backward in his memory, seeking the most recent job that had left him fulfilled, he was startled to discover it was the McAllister burglary in Marin County, north of San Francisco, the summer before last. Ordinarily, he worked only in the east near Jenny, but Branch Pollard, with whom he had pulled off the just-completed Guardmaster heist, had settled in California for a while, and during that Pacific sojourn, he had spotted Avril McAllister, a sheep waiting to be sheared. McAllister, an industrialist worth $200 million, lived on an 8-acre estate in Marin County, protected by stone walls, a complex electronic security system, and guard dogs. With information developed from a half-dozen sources, Branch had determined that McAllister was a collector of rare stamps and coins, 2 eminently fencible commodities. Besides, the industrialist was a gambler who went to Vegas 3 times a year, usually dropping $250,000 each visit, but sometimes winning big. He always took his winnings in cash to avoid the tax man, and some of that cash was surely in the mansion. Branch needed Jack's sense of strategy and expertise in electronics, and Jack needed a change of scenery, so they pulled it off with the help of a third man. After considerable planning, getting onto the estate and into the house went smoothly. They were prepared with an electronic listening device that could detect the soft tick of a safe's tumblers and amplify them, which made deducing the combination mere child's play. But as insurance, they also took a full set of safe-cracking tools and a plastic explosive. The problem was that Avril McAllister had no mere safe, he had a damn vault. The industrialist was so certain of the vault door's inviolability that he'd made no effort to conceal it with a sliding partition or tapestry. It was in one wall of the immense game room, a massive stainless steel portal as big as anything in a first-class bank. The listening device Jack had brought was not sensitive enough to detect the movement of tumblers through 20 inches of stainless steel. The plastic explosive would have peeled any safe, but the vault was blast-proof. The set of safe-crackers' tools was a joke. They left the estate with no stamps or coins, but with sterling silver, a complete collection of Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett first editions, a few jewels that Mrs. McAllister carelessly left out of the vault, and a handful of other items which they fenced for only $60,000, split 3 ways. The take was by no means a pittance, but it was far less than anticipated, insufficient to cover their expenses and to make their time planning and risks worthwhile. In spite of this debacle, Jack had gotten a kick out of the job. Once they had safely fled the McAllister estate, he and Branch had seen the humor in the catastrophe and had been able to laugh about it. They spent 2 days relaxing in the California sun. Then, on a whim, Jack took his $20,000 to Reno to see if he could do better at craps and blackjack than he had done at burglary. 24 hours after checking into Harrah's, he checked out, the $20,000 having grown to an amazing $107,455. The exquisite symmetry of bad luck money bringing good luck was enormously appealing. Deciding to extend his vacation, he rented a car and drove back to New York, all the way across the country, in a splendid mood, eager to see Jenny. Now, more than 18 months later, as he entered Manhattan on his return trip from Connecticut, Jack realized that, curiously, the fiasco at the McAllister estate had been the last enterprise to provide untainted satisfaction. At that point, he had begun a long journey from dead-end amorality all the way across the moral spectrum until he had become, once more, capable of guilt. But why? What had initiated the change in him? What continued to power it? He had no answers. All he knew was that he was no longer able to think of himself as a melancholy and romantic bandit with a just mission to redress the wrongs done to him and to his beloved wife. He was merely a thief. For 8 years he had been deluding himself. Now he saw himself for what he really was, and the sudden insight was devastating. He had not merely become a man without purpose, worse, without realizing it, he had been lacking a worthwhile purpose for 8 years. He drove aimlessly through the streets of Manhattan, going nowhere in particular, unwilling to return straight away to the apartment. He soon found himself on Fifth Avenue, approaching St. Patrick's, and on impulse he pulled to the curb, parked illegally before the main doors of the immense cathedral. He got out of the car, went around to the trunk, opened it, and pulled 6 banded stacks of $20 bills from the plastic garbage bag. It was foolhardy to leave the car illegally parked in so prominent a location when its trunk contained more than 1/3 of $1 million in stolen money, an illegally obtained device like slicks and guns. If a cop stopped to give him a ticket and became suspicious and demanded to search the car, Jack would be finished. But he had ceased to care. In some ways, he was a dead man who still walked, just as Jenny had been a dead woman who still breathed. Though not a Catholic, he pulled open one of the sculpted bronze doors of St. Patrick's, went inside, into the nave, where a handful of people knelt in the front pews, praying or saying the rosary, and where an old man was lighting a votive candle even at this hour. Jack stood for a moment, looking up at the elegant baldachin above the main altar. Then he located the poor boxes, removed the bundles of $20 bills from inside his winter jacket, broke the paper bands that bound them, and stuffed the money into the containers as if he were jamming garbage into trash receptacles. Outside again, as he was descending the granite steps, he stopped abruptly and blinked at the night-draped cityscape, for something was different about Fifth Avenue. As a few huge snowflakes spiraled lazily through the glow of street lamps and through the lights of cars moving along the thoroughfare, Jack gradually realized the city had reacquired a fraction of the glitter, glamour, and mystery that it always had for him before he'd gone to Central America, but which it had not possessed in ages. It seemed cleaner now than it had been in a long time, and the air was crisper, less polluted. Staring around in amazement, he slowly understood that the city had not undergone a metamorphosis during the past few minutes. It was the same city that it had been an hour ago and yesterday. But when he had come back from Central America, he had been a different man from the one who had gone away. And on returning, he had been unable to see anything good in the metropolis or in any other works of the society he hated. Much of the Big Apple's dreariness and degeneration had been merely a reflection of his own blasted, burnt-out, corrupted inner landscape. Jack returned to the Camaro, went west to 6th Avenue, north to Central Park, made a right turn, then another right onto 5th Avenue again. heading south, not sure where he was going until he reached the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church. Once more, he parked illegally, took cash from the trunk, and went into the church. There was no poor boxes in St. Patrick's, but Jack found a young assistant minister in the process of closing the place for the night. From various pockets, Jack produced bundles of $10 and $20 bills wrapped with rubber bands and handed them to the startled cleric, claiming to have won a fortune in the casinos of Atlantic City. In 2 stops, he had given away $30,000, but that was not even 1/10 of what he had brought back from Connecticut, and those dispensations did not allay his guilt. In fact, his newfound shame was growing stronger by the minute. The bag of money in the trunk was, to him, like the telltale heart buried under the floorboards in the story by Poe, a throbbing enunciator of his guilt, and he was as anxious to be rid of it as Poe's narrator had been anxious to silence the incriminating heartbeat of his dismembered victim. $330,000 remained. For some New Yorkers, Christmas was about to come 2.5 weeks late. Elko County, Nevada. The summer before last, Dom had stayed in room 20. He remembered it well because it was the last unit in the motel's L-shaped east wing. Ernie Bloch's curiosity was more compelling than his nyctophobia, so he decided to accompany Faye and Dom to room 20, where it was hoped that Dom's memories would be stirred by the sight of the familiar walls and furnishings. Ernie walked between Faye and Dom, who held his arms. During the trip along the breezeway, the frigid night wind made Dom glad for his fleece-lined jacket. More concerned about the black night than the chill, Ernie kept his eyes shut for the entire journey. Faye went in first, snapping on the lights, closing drapes. Dom followed with Ernie, who opened his eyes only when Faye shut the door. Upon entering the room, Dom was filled with apprehension. He walked to the queen-size bed, stared down at it. He tried to remember lying here, drugged and helpless. Faye said, "The bedspread's not the same, of course." The Polaroid had shown the corner of a floral pattern spread. The current model was brown and blue striped. "The bed itself is the same, and all the furniture," Ernie said. The padded headboard was upholstered with a coarse brown fabric, slightly snagged and worn. The nightstands were plain 2-dresser chests with laminated walnut veneer. The bases of the lamps resembled large hurricane lanterns, black metal with 2 panes of smoky amber glass on each side. The cloth shades were the same amber hue as the glass in the base. Each lamp had 2 bulbs. The main one under the shade provided most of the light. The second bulb inside the base was shaped like a candle flame and gave off a dim, flickering glow that imitated a real flame and was used only for its decorative effect to enhance the illusion of hurricane lanterns. Dom remembered every detail of the place now that he was standing in it, and he had the impression that a multitude of ghosts flitted teasingly through the room, staying just at the periphery of his vision. The ghosts were actually bad memories rather than spirits, and they haunted not the room, but the shadowy corners of his own mind. "Remember anything?" Ernie asked. "Is it coming back to you?" "I want to have a look at the John," Dom said. It was small and strictly functional, with a shower stall but no bathtub, a speckled tile floor, and durable Formica countertops. Dom was interested in the sink, for it was surely the one in his recurring nightmare, but when he looked into the bowl, he was surprised to see a mechanical stopper. And an inch below the rim of the bowl, the overflow drain consisted of 3 round holes, a more modern design than the 6 slanted lozenge-shaped outlets in the sink of his dreams. "This isn't the same," he said. "The sink was old, with the rubber stopper attached to a bead chain and hung from the cold water faucet." "We're always upgrading the place," Ernie said from the doorway. "We took that sink out 8 or 9 months ago," Faye said. "We replaced the Formica then, too, although it's the same color as before." Dom was disappointed because he had been convinced that at least some memories from those lost days would begin to return to him when he touched the sink. After all, judging from the stark terror of the nightmare, something particularly frightening had happened to him at that very spot. Therefore, it seemed likely that the sink might act as a lightning rod upon the supercharged memories that drifted in the darkness of his subconscious, drawing them back in a sudden crackling blaze of recollection. He put his hands on the new sink, but he felt only cold porcelain. "Anything?" Ernie asked again. "No," Dom said, "no memories, but bad vibrations. If I give it time, I think the room might break down the barriers. I'll sleep here tonight, give it a chance to work on me, if that's all right." "No problem," Faye said, "the room's yours." Dom said, "I have a hunch the nightmare will be worse here than it's ever been before." Laguna Beach, California. Although Parker Fane was one of the most respected of living American artists, although his canvases were assiduously collected by major museums, although he had been commissioned to create works for the President of the United States and other luminaries, he was not too old and certainly not too dignified to get a thrill from the intrigue upon which he was engaged in Dominic Corvis's behalf. To be a successful artist, one needed maturity, an adult's perception and sensitivity, and dedication to craftsmanship, but one also had to hold on to a child's curiosity, wonder, innocence, and sense of fun. Parker held tighter to those things than most artists did. Therefore, he fulfilled his role in Dom's plans with a spirit of adventure. Each day when he picked up Dom's mail, Parker pretended to go about his business without the slightest suspicion that he might be under surveillance. But in fact, he searched surreptitiously, diligently for the watchers, spies, cops, or whatever they might be. He never saw anyone observing him, and he never detected a tail. And each night when he left his house and went to a different payphone to await Dom's prearranged call, he drove miles out of his way, turned back on his own route, made sudden turns calculated to throw off a tail until he was sure that he was not being followed. A few minutes before 9 o'clock Saturday night, he arrived by his usual devious means at a telephone booth beside a Union 76 station. A hard rain fell, sluicing down the plexiglass walls, distorting the world beyond and screening Parker from prying eyes. He was wearing a trench coat and a rain-proof khaki hat with the rim turned down all the way around to let the rain run off. He felt as if he belonged in a John le Carré tale. He loved it. Promptly at 9 o'clock, the phone rang. It was Dom. "I'm on schedule at the Tranquility Motel. This is the place, Parker." Dom had a lot to tell. A disturbing experience in the Tranquility Grill, Ernie Block's nyctophobia, and by indirection he managed to convey that the Blocks had received strange Polaroid snapshots too. Discretion was essential. If the Tranquility Motel was indeed the center of the unremembered events of the summer before last, the Blocks' phones might be tapped. If the listeners heard about the photographs, they would know they had a traitor in their midst, and they would surely find him, and there would be no more notes or photos forthcoming. "I've got news too," Parker said. "Ms. Wycombe, your editor, left a message on your answering machine. Twilight in Babylon had another printing, and there are now 100,000 copies in the stores." Good God, I'd forgotten the book. Since Lomax's house 4 days ago, I haven't thought about anything but this crazy situation. Ms. Wycombe had more good news she wants to share, so you're to call her as soon as you get a chance. "I'll do that. Meanwhile, seen any interesting pictures?" Dom asked, indirectly inquiring if any more Polaroids had been received. "Nope, no amusing notes either." When the headlights of passing cars swept across the booth, the thin skin of flowing water on the transparent walls flared briefly with a rippling, shimmering brilliance. Parker said, "But something came in the mail that'll knock your socks off, buddy." "You've identified 3 of the names on those moon posters at Lomax, so how'd you like to hear who the 4th one is?" "Ginger? I forgot to tell you. I think her name's on the motel registry. Dr. Ginger Weiss of Boston. I intend to call her tomorrow." "You've stolen some of my thunder, but you'll be surprised to hear you got a letter today from Dr. Weiss. She sent it to Random House on December 26th, but it got caught in their bureaucracy. Anyway, she's at the end of her ropesy, and then she gets hold of a copy of your book, glums your photo, and she gets this feeling she's met you before and that you are a part of what's been happening to her. Do you have the letter with you? And Dom asked excitedly. Parker had it in his hand, waiting. He read it, glancing now and then at the night beyond the booth. I've got to call her right away, Dom said when Parker finished the letter. Can't wait till morning now. I'll talk to you again tomorrow night, 9 o'clock. If you'll be calling from the motel where the phones are likely to be tapped, there's no point in my running out to a phone booth. You're right, I'll call you at home. Take care, Dom said. You too. With mixed feelings, Parker put the receiver on the hook, relieved that these inconvenient nightly journeys to a payphone were at an end, but also certain that he would miss the intrigue. He stepped out of the phone booth into the rain, and he was almost disappointed when no one took a shot at him. Boston, Massachusetts. Pablo Jackson had been buried that morning, but he was with Ginger Weiss throughout the afternoon and evening. Like a ghost, his memory haunted her, a smiling revenant in the chambers of her mind. Keeping to herself in the guest room at Baywatch, she tried to read, could not concentrate. When not preoccupied with memories of the old magician, she was eaten up by worry, wondering what would become of her. She got into bed at midnight and was reaching for the switch to turn off the lamp when Rita Hanaby came to tell her that Dominic Corvasis was on the phone and that she could take the call in George's study down the hall adjacent to the master bedroom. Excited and trepidatious, Ginger put on a robe over her pajamas. The study was warm and shadowy with dark oak paneling. The Chinese carpet was beige and forest green, and the stained glass lamp on the desk was either a genuine Tiffany or a superb reproduction. George's puffy eyes made it clear that the call woke him. He began surgery early most mornings and was usually in bed by 9:30. I'm sorry, Ginger told him. No need, George said. Isn't this what we've been hoping for? Maybe, she said, unwilling to raise her hopes. Rita said, we'll give you privacy. No, Ginger said, stay, please. She went to the desk, sat down, picked up the uncradled handset. Hello, Mr. Corvasis? Dr. Weiss? His voice was strong yet melodic. Writing to me was the best thing you could have done. I don't think you're nuts, because you're not alone, Doctor. There are more of us with strange problems. Ginger tried to respond, but her voice cracked. She cleared her throat. I'm sorry. I don't usually cry. Corvasis said, don't try to talk until you're ready. I'll tell you about my problem, sleepwalking, and my dreams about the moon. A thrill, half cold fear and half exultation, throbbed through her. The moon, she agreed. I never remember the dreams, but they must involve the moon because that's what I wake up screaming about. He told her about a man named Lomac in Reno, dead by his own hand, driven to suicide by an obsession with the moon. Ginger sensed some vast gulf beneath her, a fearful unknown. We've been brainwashed, she blurted. All these problems we're having are the result of repressed memories trying to surface. For a moment there was a stunned silence on the line. Then the writer said, that's been my theory, but you sound sure of it. I am. I underwent hypnotic regression therapy after I wrote to you, and we turned up evidence of systematic memory repression. Something happened to us the summer before last, he said. Yes, the summer before last. The Tranquility Motel in Nevada. That's where I'm calling from. Startled, she said, you're there now? Yes, and if possible, you ought to come. A lot has happened that I can't risk talking about on the phone. Who are they? She asked in frustration. What are they hiding? We'll have a better chance finding out if we all work together. I'll come tomorrow if I can book a flight that quickly. Rita started to protest that Ginger was in no condition to travel. In the many-colored light of the Tiffany lamp, George's scowl deepened. To Corvasis, Ginger said, I'll let you know how and when I'll arrive. When Ginger hung up, George said, you can't possibly go all that way in your condition. Rita said, "What if you black out on the airplane, become violent?" "I'll be all right." "Dear, you had 3 seizures last Monday, one after the other." Ginger sighed and slumped back in the green leather chair. "Rita, George, you've been wonderful to me, and I can never adequately repay you. I love you, I really do. But I've been living with you for 5 weeks, 5 helpless weeks during which I've been more like a dependent child than an adult, and I'm just not capable of going on that way. I've got to go to Nevada. I've no other option. I've got to go. I've got to." New York, New York. A couple of blocks farther down Fifth Avenue from the Presbyterian Church, Jack stopped again in front of St. Thomas's Episcopal Church. In the nave, he stared in fascination at the huge reredos, R-E-R-E-D-O-S, of Dunville stone behind the altar. He met the strangely portentous gazes of the statues in the shadowy niches along the walls, saints, apostles, the Blessed Virgin, Christ, and he realized that the primary purpose of religion was the expiation of guilt, to provide people with forgiveness for being less than they were meant to be. The human species seemed incapable of living up to its potential, and some would be driven mad by guilt if they did not believe that a God, be it Jesus, Yahweh, Mohammed, Marx, or some other, looked on them with favor in spite of themselves. But Jack found no comfort in St. Thomas's, no expiation of his sins, not even when he left $20,000 in the charity box. In the Camaro again, he set out to dispose of the rest of the cash from the Guardmaster heist, not because giving it away would solve his guilt. It would not, for redistribution of the funds was not the moral equivalent of repayment. He had too much to atone for to expect to shrive himself of all his transgressions in one night. But he did not need or want the money anymore, could not simply throw it in the trash, so giving the damn stuff away was his only possible course of action. He stopped at more churches and temples, some were open, some locked. Where he could gain entrance, he left money. He drove down to the Bowery and left $40,000 with the startled night attendant at the Salvation Army mission. On Bayard Street in nearby Chinatown, Jack saw a sign in a second-floor window that proclaimed in both Chinese characters and in English the Alliance Against Oppression of Chinese Minorities. The place was above a quaint apothecary that specialized in the herbs and powdered roots of traditional Chinese medicines. The apothecary was closed, but a light shone in a window of the Alliance offices. Jack rang the bell at the street-level door, rang it until an elderly and wizened Chinese man came down the stairs and spoke to him through a small grill. When Jack ascertained that the Alliance's current major project was the rescue of brutalized Chinese families from Vietnam and resettlement in the States, he passed $20,000 in cash through the grill. The Chinese gentleman reverted to his native language in surprise and came out into the cold winter wind, insistent upon shaking hands. "Friend," the elderly mandarin said, "you can't know what suffering this gift will relieve." Jack echoed the old man, "Friend." In that single word, and in the warm grasp of the venerable Oriental's calloused hand, Jack found something he thought he had lost forever, a sense of belonging, a feeling of community, fellowship. In his car again, he drove up Bayard to Mott Street, turned right, and had to pull to the curb. A flood of tears blurred his vision. He could not remember ever having been more confused than he was now. He wept in part because the stain of guilt, for the moment at least, seemed an ineradicable mark upon his soul. Yet some of the tears were tears of joy, for he was abruptly brimming over with brotherhood. For the better part of a decade, he had been outside society, distanced in mind and spirit, if not in body. But now, for the first time since Central America, Jack Twist had the need, desire, and ability to reach out to the society around him, to make friends. Bitterness was a dead end. Hatred hurt no one more than he who harbored it. The wine of alienation was loneliness. During the past 8 years, he had often wept for Jenny, and he had sometimes wept in fits of self-pity. But these tears were different from all others he had let previously, for they were cleansing tears, purging tears, washing all the rage and resentment out of him. He still did not understand the cause of these radical and rapid changes taking place in him. However, he sensed that his evolution from outcast and criminal to law-abiding citizen was not finished and would generate several more surprises before it reached a conclusion. He wondered where he was bound and by what route he would arrive there. That night in Chinatown, hope swept back into his world like a summer breeze, stirring music from a cluster of wind chimes. Elko County, Nevada. Ned and Sandy Sarver were able to run the diner by themselves because they were hard workers by nature, but also because their menu was simple and because Ned had learned efficient food service as a cook in the U.S. Army. 100 tricks were employed to make the Tranquility Grill function smoothly with as little effort as possible. Nevertheless, at the end of work, Ned was always glad that Ernie and Faye provided the motel's guests with a free continental breakfast in their room, so it was not necessary to open the diner before noon. Saturday evening, while he grilled hamburgers and made French fries and served chili dogs, Ned Sarver glanced frequently at Sandy as she worked. He still could not get used to the change in her, the sudden flowering. She had added 10 pounds, and her figure had acquired an appealing female roundness it never possessed before. And she no longer shuffled slump-shouldered through the diner, but moved with a fluid grace and a jaunty good humor that Ned found enormously appealing. He was not the only man who had eyes for the new Sandy. Some of the truckers watched the roll of her hips and the flex of her buttocks as she crossed the room with plates of food or bottles of cold beer. Until recently, although Sandy had been unfailingly polite to the customers, she had not been chatty. That changed too. She was still somewhat shy, but she responded to the truckers' teasing and even teased them in return, and came up with some damn good quips. For the first time in 8 years of marriage, Ned Sarver feared losing Sandy. He knew she loved him, and he told himself that these changes in her appearance and personality would not also change the nature of the relationship, but that was precisely what he feared. This morning, when Sandy went to Elko to meet Ernie and Faye at the airport, Ned had worried that she would not come back. Maybe she would just keep going until she found a place she liked better than Nevada, until she met a man who was handsomer, richer, and smarter than Ned. He knew that he was being unfair to Sandy by harboring such suspicions, that she was incapable of infidelity or cruelty. Maybe his fear lay in the fact that he'd always thought Sandy deserved better than him. At 9:30, when the dinner crowd thinned to 7 customers, Faye and Ernie came into the grill with that dark, good-looking guy who had caused a scene earlier in the evening when he had wandered through the door as if in a dream, and then had turned and run out as though hellhounds were at his heels. Ned wondered who the guy was, how he knew Faye and Ernie, and whether they knew their friend was a little weird. Ernie looked pale and shaky, and to Ned it seemed as if his boss was taking considerable care to keep his back to the windows. When he raised a hand in greeting to Ned, there was a visible tremor in it. Faye and the stranger sat facing each other across the table, and from the looks they gave Ernie, you could see they were concerned about him. They didn't look so good themselves. Something peculiar was going on. Intrigued by Ernie's condition, Ned was briefly distracted from thoughts of Sandy leaving him. But when Sandy stopped at their table, she was so long taking their order that Ned's concern rose again. From his post behind the counter with a hamburger and a pair of eggs sizzling noisily on the griddle, he could not hear what they were saying over there. But he had the crazy notion that the stranger was taking undue interest in Sandy, and that she was responding to his slick patter. Jealous nonsense, of course. Yet the guy was handsome, and he was younger than Ned, closer Sandy's age, and apparently successful. Just the kind of guy she ought to run off with, because he would be better for her than Ned could ever be. In his own view, Ned Sarver was not much to brag about. He was not ugly, but certainly not handsome. His brown hair had receded from his forehead in a deep widow's peak. Unless you were Jack Nicholson, such a hairline was not sexy. He had pale gray eyes that perhaps had been startling and magnetic when he was a young man, but with the passing years they merely made him appear tired and washed out. He was neither rich nor destined to be rich, and at 42, 10 years older than Sandy, Ned Sarver was not likely to be gripped suddenly by the driving need to make something of himself. All of this dismaying self-criticism roiled through his mind as he watched Sandy finally leave the stranger's table and come to the counter. With an odd and troubled expression, she handed the order slip to him and said, "What time are we closing? 10 or 10:30? 10, indicating the few customers Ned had no profit hanging around tonight. She nodded and went back to Faye, Ernie, and the stranger. Her brusqueness and her speedy return to the stranger aggravated Ned's worries. As far as he could see, he had only 3 qualities that gave Sandy any reason to stay with him. First, he could always make a decent living as a short-order cook because he was good. Second, he had a talent for fixing things, both inanimate objects and living creatures. If a toaster, blender, or radio went on the blink, Ned set to work with the toolkit and soon had the appliance back in operation. Likewise, if he found a panicky bird with a broken wing, he stroked it until it grew calm, took it home, nursed it back to health, and sent it on its way. Having the talent to fix things seemed important, and Ned was proud of it. Third, he loved Sandy with all his body, mind, and heart. Preparing the order for Faye, Ernie, and the stranger, Ned glanced repeatedly at Sandy, and he was surprised when she and Faye started moving around the room, lowering the leveler blinds over the windows. Something unusual was going on. Returning to Ernie's table, Sandy leaned forward in earnest conversation with the good-looking stranger. It was ironic that he worried about losing Sandy, for it had been his talent for fixing things that contributed to her transformation from duckling to swan. When Ned first met her at a diner in Tucson where they worked, Sandy was not just bashful and self-conscious, but painfully shy, fearful. She was a hard worker, always willing to lend a hand to other waitresses when they got behind in their orders, but she was incapable of interacting with anyone on a personal level. A pale, scuttling girl, 23, but still more girl than woman. She was reluctant to open the door on friendship for fear she would put her trust in someone who might hurt her. She had been drab, mousy, meek, beaten by life, and the instant Ned had seen her, he had felt the need to fix things for her. With enormous patience, he began work on her, so subtly that at first she was not aware that he was interested in her. They were married 9 months later, although his repair work on her was far from finished. She was more badly broken than any creature he'd encountered before. And there were times when, in frustration, he felt that, even with his talent, he would be unable to fix her, and would spend the rest of his life tinkering endlessly without much effect. During their first 6 years of marriage, however, he had witnessed a slow healing in her, maddeningly gradual. Sandy had an indisputably bright mind, but she was retarded emotionally. She learned to take and give affection only with tremendous effort, much as a dim-witted child struggles mightily to learn to count to 10. The first indication Ned had that major changes were taking place in Sandy was the sudden marked improvement in her sexual appetite. The turnaround had come in late August 2 summers ago. She'd never been a hesitant lover. She exhibited extensive carnal knowledge, but she made love more like a machine than a woman with a joyless expertise. He had never known a woman as silent in bed as Sandy had been. He suspected something in her childhood had stunted her, the same thing that had broken her spirit. He tried to get her to talk about it, but she was adamant about letting the past stay buried, and his persistence was the one thing that might have caused her to leave him. So he asked about it no more, though it was difficult to fix something when you could not get at the part of it that was broken. Then, in August of the summer before last, she came to the conjugal bed with a noticeably different attitude. Nothing dramatic at first, no sudden release of long imprisoned passions. Initially, the change involved only a subtle new relaxation during the act of love. Sometimes she smiled or murmured his name as he made love to her. Slowly, she blossomed. By that Christmas, 4 months after the change began, she no longer lay upon the bed as if she were made of metal. She strove to find and match his rhythm, searching for the fulfillment that still eluded her. Slowly, she freed the erotic power chained within her. Finally, on April 7 last year, a night Ned would never forget, Sandy had an orgasm for the first time. It was a climax of such power that for a moment it frightened Ned. Afterwards, she wept with happiness and clung to him with such gratitude, love, and trust that he wept as well. He thought her orgasmic breakthrough would finally enable her to speak of the source of her long-hidden pain. But when he cautiously inquired, she rebuffed him. The past is past, Ned. Won't help to dwell on it. If I talk about it, that might just give it a new hold on me. Through last spring, summer, and early autumn, Sandy gradually achieved satisfaction more often, until by September, their lovemaking nearly always brought her for fulfillment. And by Christmas Day, less than 3 weeks ago, it was clear that her sexual maturation was not the only change in her, but was accompanied by a new pride and self-respect. Concomitant with her sexual development, Sandy learned to enjoy driving, an activity she had once found even less pleasurable than sex. Initially, she expressed the modest intention of driving to work from their trailer out near BOO. Before long, she was lighting out in the truck on solo spins. Sometimes Ned stood at a window and watched his uncaged birds soar off, and he viewed each flight with delight, but also with an uneasiness he could not explain. By New Year's Day, just past, the uneasiness became dread and was with him 24 hours a day, and by then he understood it. He was afraid Sandy would fly away from him, maybe with the stranger who'd come in with Ernie and Faye. I'm probably overreacting, Ned thought as he put 3 hamburger patties on the griddle. Fact is, I know damn well I'm overreacting. But he worried. By the time Ned prepared cheeseburgers with all the fixings for the Blocks and their friend, the other customers were gone. As Sandy served the loaded plates, Faye locked the door and switched on the closed sign that was visible from I-80, though it was shy of 10 o'clock. Ned joined them for a closer look at the stranger and to insinuate himself between the guy and Sandy. When he got to their table, he was surprised to see that Sandy had a bottle of beer and had opened one for him too. He did not drink much. Sandy drank less. You'll need it when you hear what they have to tell us, Sandy said. In fact, you might even need a couple more bottles. The guy's name was Dominic Corvasis, and he had an amazing tale that drove all worries of infidelity from Ned's mind. When Corvasis was finished, Ernie and Faye had an incredible story of their own, and that was when Ned first learned about the ex-Marine's fear of the dark. But I remember we were evacuated, Ned said. We couldn't have been here at the hotel those 3 days, 'cause I remember we had a sort of mini vacation at home, watching TV, reading Lewis L'Amour. I believe that's what you were told to remember, Corvasis said. Did anyone visit you at the trailer during that time? Any neighbors drop by? Anyone who could confirm that you were actually there? We're outside BOO, where we don't really have neighbors. Far as I remember, we didn't see anybody who could swear we was there. Sandy said, Ned, they wondered if anything strange has been happening to either of us. Ned met his wife's eyes. Without words, he let her know it was up to her whether she told them about the changes she had been undergoing. Corvasis said the 2 of you were here the night it happened. Whatever it was, it started while I was having dinner, so you must have been a part of it, but the memory was stolen from you. The thought of strangers messing with his mind gave Ned the creeps. Uneasy, he studied the 5 Polaroid snapshots that Faye had fanned out on the table, especially the picture of Corvasis staring empty-eyed. To Sandy, Faye said, honey, Ernie and I would have to have been blind not to have noticed the changes in you recently. I don't mean to embarrass you and I don't want to pry, but if those changes might be related to whatever happened to us, then we ought to know about it. Sandy reached for Ned's hand, held it. Her love for him was so evident that he was ashamed of himself for the ridiculous thoughts of betrayal that had preoccupied him earlier. Staring intently at her beer, she said, most all my life I've had the lowest opinion of myself. I'll tell you why, because you've got to know how bad it was for me when I was a kid, if you want to understand how miraculous it is that I ever found any self-respect. It was Ned who first lifted me up, believed in me, gave me a chance to be somebody. Her hand tightened on his. Almost 9 years ago, he started courting me, and he was the first person ever treated me like a lady. He married me knowing that inside I was tied up in tangled knots, and he spent 8 years doing his best to untie and untangle them. He thinks I don't know how hard he's tried to help me, but I know all right. Her voice cracked with emotion. She paused for a swallow of beer. Ned was unable to speak. Sandy said, the thing is, I want everyone to know that maybe what happened the summer before last, the thing none of us remembers, maybe it did have a powerful effect on me. But if Ned hadn't taken me under his wing all those years ago, I never would have had a chance. Love enwrapped Ned as if it were bands of iron, closing his throat, constricting his chest, applying a pleasant pressure to his heart. She glanced at him, returned her gaze to the bottle of beer, and recounted a childhood in hell. She did not describe her father's violations of her in explicit detail, and she spoke demurely, almost primly, of her periodic exploitation as a child prostitute under the management of a Vegas pimp. Her account of this monstrous abuse was all the more shocking and moving because she related it without drama. Everyone at the table listened in a silence resulting not merely from shock, but from respect for her suffering and from a certain reverence for her ultimate triumph. When Sandy finished, Ned embraced her, held her close. He was amazed by her strength. He had always known she was special, and the things she told him tonight only strengthened his love and admiration. Though he was deeply saddened by what had been done to Sandy, he was delighted that she was at last able to talk about it. Surely this meant that the past had lost its hold on her. Faye and Ernie commiserated with her in the awkward manner of friends who want to help but who know they can offer only words. Everyone needed another beer. Ned got 5 bottles of Dos Equis out of the cooler and brought them to the table. Corvasis, who no longer seemed like the enemy to Ned, shook his head and blinked, as if Sandy's story had left him in a daze of horror. This turns things upside down. I mean, if our unremembered experience had one basic effect on the rest of us, it was terror. Oh, I benefited because I was brought out of my shell. I shared that with Sandy. But Ernie, Dr. Weiss, Lomac, and me, we were for the most part left with a residue of fear. Now Sandy tells us the effect on her was strictly beneficial, not frightening in the least. How could it affect us so differently? You really have no fear, Sandy? None, Sandy said. Ever since Ernie pulled a chair up to the table, he'd been sitting with his shoulders hunched and his head lowered, as if protecting his neck from attack. Now, with one hand clamped around a bottle of Dos Equis, he leaned back and relaxed, though not much. Yeah, fear's the core of it, but you remember that place along the interstate I told you about, little more than a quarter mile from here? I'm sure something weird happened there, something that relates to the brainwashing. But when I'm standing at that place, I feel more than just fear. My heart starts to race and I get excited. But it's not entirely a bad excitement. Fear's a part of it, yeah, maybe the biggest part of it. But there's a stew of other emotions as well. Sandy said, I think the place Ernie's talking about is where I often wind up when I take the truck out for a ride. I'm drawn there. Ernie leaned forward excited. I knew it. Coming back from the airport this morning as we were passing that place, you let the truck slow way down, and I said to myself, Sandy feels it too. Faye said, "Sandy, what exactly do you feel when you're drawn to that piece of ground?" With a smile so warm that Ned could almost feel the heat of it, Sandy said, "Peace. I feel at peace there. It's hard to explain, but it's as if the rocks, dirt, and trees all radiate harmony, tranquility." "I don't feel peaceful there," Ernie said. "Fear, yes, a queer excitement, an eerie sense that something shattering will happen, something that I'm eager for, even though it scares the hell out of me." "And I feel none of what you feel," Sandy said. "We ought to go there," Ned suggested, "see if the place affects the rest of us." "In the morning," Corvasis said, "when it's light." Faye said, "I can see this might have had a different effect on each of us, but why has it changed Dom's and Sandy's and Ernie's lives, and the lives of that Mr. Lomack in Reno and Dr. Weiss in Boston, yet done nothing to Ned and me? Why aren't we having problems too?" Dom said, "Maybe the brainwashers did a better job on you and Ned." That thought gave Ned the heebie-jeebies again. For a while they discussed their situation, and then Ned suggested that Corvasis try to recreate his actions on that Friday night, July 6th, up to the point where his memories were erased. "You recollect the early part of the evening better than we do, and when you came in the first time tonight, you were close to remembering something important." "Close," Corvasis agreed, "but at the last moment, when I felt the memory within grasp, it scared the crap out of me, and the next thing I knew, I was running for the door. Made quite a spectacle of myself. I was totally freaked out. It was such a visceral thing, instinctual, so utterly uncontrollable, that I think it would probably happen again if I made a second attempt to force the memories." "Still, it's worth a try," Ned said. "And you've got us for moral support this time," Faye said. Corvasis needed coaxing, which Ned interpreted as meaning that the experience earlier this evening had been considerably more unnerving than words could express. But at last the writer got up and, carrying his glass of beer, went to the front door of the diner. He stood with his back to the exit, chugged a long swell of Dos Equis. He looked around the room, trying hard to see the people of that other time. He said there were 3 or 4 men sitting at the counter, maybe a dozen customers altogether. I can't remember their faces. Moving away from the door, he walked past Ned and the others to the next table, where he pulled out a chair and sat with his back turned partly toward them. "This is where I sat. Sandy waited on me. I took a bottle of Coors while I looked at the menu, ordered the ham and egg sandwich, French fries, coleslaw. As I was salting the fries, the shaker slipped out of my hand, salt spilled on the table. I threw a pinch over my shoulder. Silly gesture. Threw it too hard. Dr. Weiss. Ginger Weiss was the woman I threw the salt on. I didn't remember that before, but I can see her clearly now, the blonde in the photo." Faye tapped the Polaroid snapshot of Dr. Weiss that was on the table in front of Ned. Still sitting alone at the other table, Corvasis said, "Quite a beautiful woman. Pixie cute, yet also sophisticated looking. A really interesting mix. Could hardly take my eyes off her." Ned looked more closely at the photo of Ginger Weiss. He supposed she might indeed be unusually attractive when her face was not so pale and slack, when her eyes were not so cold, empty, dead. In a voice that had grown odd, as if he were actually speaking to them from out of the past, Corvasis said, "She sits in the corner booth by the window, facing this way. Sunset is near. The sun's out there on the horizon, balanced like a big red ball, and the diner's filled with orange light slanting in through the windows, almost like firelight. Ginger Weiss looks especially lovely in that light. I can hardly keep from staring openly at her. Twilight now. I've got a second beer." He sipped some Dos Equis. When he continued, his voice was softer. "The plains are all purple, then black. Night." Like Ernie and Faye and Sandy, Ned was spellbound by the writer's struggle to remember, for it stirred in him at last, faint and shapeless, but compelling memories of his own. He began to recall that particular evening out of the many he'd spent in the Tranquility Grill. The young priest had been here, the one in the Polaroid snapshot now lying on the table, and the young couple with their little girl. Not long after nightfall, nursing my second beer, mainly so I can stare at Ginger Weiss a little longer, Corvasis looked left, right, raised his right hand to his ear. An unusual sound of some kind, I remember that much. A distant rumble, getting louder. He was silent for a while. Can't remember what happened next. Something, but it just won't come. As the writer spoke of the rumbling, Ned Sarver experienced the vaguest possible memory of that frightening, swelling sound, but he could not clearly call it to mind. He felt as if Corvasis had brought him to the edge of a dark chasm into which he was desperately afraid to look, but into which he must look, and now they were turning away without shining a light down in those black depths. Heart racing, he said, concentrate on remembering the sound, the exact sound, and maybe that'll bring the rest of it back to you. Corvasis pushed his chair back from the table, got up, rumbling like thunder, very distant thunder, but growing closer. He stood beside the table, seeking the direction from which the sound had come, looking left, right, up, down at the floor. Suddenly Ned heard the noise, not in memory, but in reality, not back there in the past, but now, the hollow roll of faraway thunder. But it came in one endless peal, not a series of rising and falling crashes, and it was growing louder, louder. Ned looked at the others. They heard it too. Louder, louder. Now he could feel the vibrations in his bones. He could not remember what had happened that night, but he knew the astonishing events they had endured had started with this sound. He pushed back his chair and got up. He was awash in a rising tide of fear, and he had to fight against the urge to run. Sandy stood, and there was fear in her face as well. Though the unknown events seemed to have had an entirely positive effect on her, she was frightened now. She put one hand on Ned's arm for reassurance. Ernie and Faye were frowning, looking around for the source of the noise, but they did not yet appear frightened. Their memory of the sound was apparently more thoroughly scrubbed away, so they could not as easily connect it with the events of that Friday night in July. Another sound arose, underlying the thunder-like rumble, a queer, ululating whistle. That, too, was unpleasantly familiar to Ned. It was happening again. Whatever had taken place that night more than 18 months ago was somehow being repeated. Jesus, happening all over again. And Ned heard himself saying, "No, no, no!" Corvasis backed a couple of steps away from his table, cast a glance at Ned and the others. He was white-faced. The growing roar began to resonate in the window glass behind the closed blinds. A loose pane, unseen, started rattling in its frame. The level-or blinds were vibrating now, adding a jangly chorus. Sandy's hold on Ned became a panicky clutch. Ernie and Faye were on their feet, and they were no longer merely bewildered, but as afraid as everyone else. The ululant whistle had grown in volume with the thunder. Now it became piercingly shrill, an oscillating electronic shriek. "What is it?" Sandy cried, and the continuous fulminations attained such volume and power that the walls of the Tranquility Grill shook. On the table at which Corvasis had been sitting, the beer glass fell on its side, cracking, spilling what Dos Equis remained in it. Ned looked at the table beside him and saw the objects on it: ketchup bottle, mustard dispenser, salt and pepper shakers, ashtray, glasses, plates, silverware, bouncing, clinking against one another, moving back and forth across the surface. A beer glass toppled, and another, and the ketchup bottle. Wide-eyed, Ned and the others turned this way and that, as if in anticipation of the imminent materialization of a demonic entity. Throughout the room, objects fell off tables. The clock with the Coors logo leapt from the hook on which it hung, crashed to the floor. This very thing had happened that night in July. Ned remembered as much, but he could not remember what had come next. "Stop it!" Ernie shouted with the conviction and authority of a Marine officer accustomed to obedience, but without effect. Earthquake? Ned wondered. A quake did not explain the electronic shriek that accompanied the thunder. The chairs jittered across the floor, bumping against one another. One of them slid into Corvasis, and the rider jumped in surprise. Ned could feel the floor shaking. The thunder-like rumble and the accompanying oscillatory shriek rose to an ear-splitting peak, and with the hard, flat crash of a bomb blast, the big front windows imploded. Faye screamed and threw her arms up in front of her face, and Ernie stumbled backward and nearly fell over a chair. Sandy buried her face against Ned's chest. They might have been badly cut by flying glass if the closed blinds had not imposed a barrier between them and the shattering panes. Even so, the force of the implosion flung the blinds up as a strong wind might blow curtains at an open window, and some glittering shards fell onto the booths, rained over Ned, and smashed on the floor around him. Silence. The implosion of the windows was followed by a profound silence, disturbed only by a few last loose little pieces of glass falling out of window frames one at a time. On that Friday night in July, the summer before last, much more than this had happened, though Ned could not remember what. Tonight, however, the mysterious drama apparently was not going to progress as far as it had gone then, for now it was over. Dom Corvasis was bleeding lightly from a nick in his cheek, hardly worse than a shaving cut. Ernie's forehead and the back of his right hand had been slightly scratched by splinters of glass. When he had determined that Sandy was unhurt, Ned reluctantly left her and rushed to the front door. He went out into the night in search of the cause of the weird noise and destruction, but he found only the deep, dark, solemn silence of the plains. No smoke or blackened rubble marked the source of an explosion. At the bottom of the hill on which the Tranquility Motel and Grill stood, widely separated cars and trucks moved on the interstate. Over at the motel, drawn by the commotion, a few guests had come outside in their night clothes. The sky above was full of stars. The air was numbingly cold, but there was no wind, only a soft breeze, like the frigid sigh of death. Nothing in sight could have caused the thunder, shaking, or implosion of the windows. Dom Corvasis came out of the grill, bewildered. "What the hell?" "I was hoping you'd know," Ned responded. "It's what happened the summer before last." "I know, but just the start of it. Damn it, I can't remember what happened that night after the windows blew in." "Me neither," Ned replied. Corvasis turned his hands palms up, held them out for inspection. In the blue neon light from the sign on the diner's roof, Ned saw rings of swollen flesh in the writer's palms. Because the light was blue, he could not ascertain the true color of the marks, but from what Corvasis had told them earlier, Ned knew the rings were an angry red. "What the hell?" Corvasis said again. Sandy was standing in the open door of the diner, backlit by the fluorescent glow from inside, and Ned went to her, embraced her. He felt one shudder after another passing through her, but he did not realize how badly he was trembling until she said, "You're shaking like a leaf." Ned Sarver was scared sick. With an almost clairvoyant vividness, he sensed that they were involved in something of monumental importance, something unimaginably dangerous, and that it was likely to end in death for some or all of them. He was a natural-born fixer of both inanimate objects and people, a damn good repairman, but this time he was up against a force with which he did not know how to tinker. What if Sandy were killed? He took pride in his talents, but even the best fixer in the whole damn world could not undo the wreckage wrought by death. For the first time since meeting her in Tucson, Ned felt powerless to protect his wife. At the horizon, the moon had begun to rise.